The Simpsons debuted on December 17th, 1989, and from the very beginning it had rules. Not written rules. Not the kind of rules you find in a writer's room Bible or a network standards memo. The kind of rules that form naturally when a story establishes its own world. The kind of rules that an audience absorbs without thinking about them. The way you absorb the rules of your own neighborhood. You learn where it's safe to walk. You learn which houses have dogs. You learn that the light at the corner of Maple and Fifth takes exactly 45 seconds to change, and you stop even watching it because the rhythm is just part of you now. Springfield had that kind of gravity. It settled into you over time. And the settling was comfortable because the rules made sense. There was a nuclear power plant owned by a withered, ancient billionaire who ran it with contemptuous disregard for safety or human life. There was a family on Evergreen Terrace, a husband and wife and 3 children, living in a house that sat between a neighbor who was a model of cheerful religiosity and a town that functioned as a satirical mirror for everything happening in America at any given moment. There was a school, a bar, a police station, a church, a retirement home, a shopping mall, a monorail that got built once and then was never mentioned again, which is itself a kind of rule. The rule was that Springfield felt real. Not photographically real, not documentarily real, but emotionally real. The jokes were exaggerated, but the feelings underneath them were grounded. Homer lost his temper. Marge worried. Bart pushed and pushed and pushed until something gave. Lisa ached for a world that matched the one inside her head. These were recognizable human experiences wrapped in yellow skin and presented through a frame of absurdist satire. The world had rules, and the rules held. For a while, what we're going to talk about tonight, and this is a conversation that stretches across decades of episodes and dozens of contradictions, is what happened when the show started bending those rules, then breaking them, then looking at the broken pieces on the floor, shrugging, sweeping them under the rug, and building something new on top of the rubble, without ever acknowledging that the rubble was there. The Simpsons broke its own rules more times than almost any other show in television history, and it did it in ways that range from small, gentle continuity errors that you notice only on a third or fourth watch, all the way up to seismic shifts in character that essentially turned the same named person into an entirely different human being across the span of a few seasons. But here's what makes this interesting, and what makes it worth spending a long, quiet evening exploring together. The rule-breaking in The Simpsons is not random. It is not the product of lazy writers or a production team that stopped caring. The contradictions follow patterns. They cluster around certain characters, certain relationships, certain themes. And when you start mapping those clusters, when you start tracing the lines between the broken rules, you find something underneath that looks less like carelessness and more like a strange kind of honesty. The show broke its rules because the rules were always in tension with what the show was actually trying to do. So let's start at the beginning. Let's establish what the rules actually were, because you cannot fully appreciate how a rule breaks unless you understand what the rule was doing in the first place. The first and most foundational rule of The Simpsons was consequence. In the early seasons, what happened in an episode mattered. Not in the way that serialized dramas matter, where every conversation feeds into the next and characters remember everything that's ever happened to them, but in the way that a realistic sketch of a family matters, where the texture of the relationships is consistent, where the emotional truth of one episode bleeds into the next, where you feel the weight of accumulated experience even when the specific events are not directly referenced. In Season 1, Homer genuinely wrestles with his shortcomings as a father. In the episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, he goes to a dog track on Christmas Eve because he has no money for presents, and the stakes feel real because his shame feels real. He is not a buffoon in that episode. He is a man trying very hard and failing in ways that are specific and earned and human. When he comes home with the dog instead of cash, the family's response is warm, but the undercurrent of financial precariousness doesn't dissolve. It lingers into subsequent episodes. The world remembers. The second major rule was character consistency. The characters in early Simpsons had fixed psychological profiles. Homer was not smart, but he was not stupid in an exaggerated cartoon way. He was working class, impulsive, prone to selfishness, but also genuinely tender with his family when the chips were down. He had a temper that rose fast and fell fast and left him sheepish in its wake. He had specific fears and specific pleasures and a specific relationship with embarrassment that made him recognizable. You knew Homer. Marge was patient but not infinitely patient. She had opinions. She had moments of genuine rebellion. She was a woman managing the gap between the life she had imagined and the life she was living, and she managed that gap with a grace that came at a cost. You could feel the cost when the show let you. Bart was charismatic and self-destructive and terrified underneath the bravado. The bravado was the armor. Peel it back and there was a 10-year-old boy who was convinced he was already broken and was testing the theory daily. The show understood this about Bart in its early years in a way that gave his pranks weight. They were not just funny. They were expressions of a specific, complicated psychology. Lisa was the conscience of the family and the show, and in the early seasons that role carried genuine loneliness. Being the smartest person in every room you enter is not the gift it appears to be when you are 8 years old and every room is Springfield. These were the characters. These were the rules. The characters had coherent inner lives. The world remembered what happened to them. The emotional logic was consistent. And then, season by season, episode by episode, the rules began to bend. The bending started gently. It started the way most things start, which is gradually and in places where you're not quite looking directly. A joke would go a little further than the established character would normally allow. Homer would do something slightly more cartoonishly destructive than the Homer of Season 2 would have done. Bart would pull a prank with slightly less psychological complexity underneath it. The comedy would deepen into broader strokes, and the broader strokes were funny, so nobody objected. But underneath the broadening comedy, something was happening to the rules. The rules were becoming suggestions. And suggestions are very different from rules. A rule is a boundary. A suggestion is an invitation to negotiate. The show began negotiating with itself constantly, and the negotiations were rarely acknowledged. A character would be established to have a particular fear in one episode, and then that same fear would be absent 3 seasons later when forgetting it made a joke work better. A relationship between two characters would carry a specific history that was referenced once and then silently discarded when a new dynamic was funnier. The town would experience something catastrophic, something that by any realistic measure would permanently alter the community, and by the next week everything would be back to normal without explanation. This is what the industry calls the reset button. Every episodic sitcom uses some version of it. The nature of weekly television, especially in the pre-streaming era, was that episodes needed to function as self-contained units. You could not assume your audience had seen every previous episode in order. You could not build elaborate continuity structures that required a PhD in Simpsons lore to navigate. Every episode had to be accessible on its own terms. The Simpsons used the reset button. Every sitcom did. But what made The Simpsons unusual, what turned its use of the reset into something genuinely strange and worth examining, was the scale of what it reset. Other sitcoms reset minor things. Arguments got resolved. Temporary job changes got reversed. Romantic tensions that flared up in an episode got cooled down by the credits. The Simpsons reset enormous things. It reset events of almost geological significance. It reset the emotional architecture of relationships. It reset facts about who characters fundamentally were. And it did this not just between seasons, but sometimes within a single season, or even, in the more adventurous cases, within a single episode. We will get into the specifics of all of this. We will take each major category of rule-breaking and sit with it, examine it, turn it over, and look at what's underneath. But first, one more thing about the original rules. Because there is a detail about the early seasons that tends to get lost in the retrospective analysis, and it matters for understanding everything that follows. In the beginning, The Simpsons was not trying to be a beloved institution. It was trying to be dangerous. Matt Groening had created a cartoon family for a sketch segment on The Tracy Ullman Show, and when those sketches got their own half-hour series, the ambition was not to make something warm and comforting. The ambition was to make something abrasive and honest and genuinely uncomfortable. The Simpsons was supposed to be a gut punch dressed up as a cartoon. It was supposed to show an American family that was recognizable precisely because it was flawed in specific, documented ways, because the flaws were not softened or resolved by the end of the episode, but simply absorbed into the family's ongoing life. Bart was controversial in the early 90s. Parents were actually concerned. There were school principals banning Bart Simpson t-shirts, which, in retrospect, is exactly the kind of overreaction that The Simpsons would have satirized with visible glee. But the controversy was real because the character was genuinely transgressive in the context of what animated television had been doing before him. Bart was not Bugs Bunny. He was not clever chaos contained within a narrative that always corrected itself. He was a kid with genuine behavioral issues and a family that was struggling, visibly and specifically, to manage those issues, and the management was not always successful. Homer was controversial too, in a quieter way. The portrayal of a father who was genuinely not very good at fathering, who stumbled into moments of grace rather than inhabiting grace naturally, was not what American television had been doing with its father figures. Homer was not a corrective fantasy, he was a portrait. Those early ambitions, the dangerous ones, the uncomfortable ones, established the baseline rules. The rules were in service of honesty. The show would be honest about what American family life actually looked like in the specific, economically pressured, emotionally complicated way that it actually looked. And then the show became an institution. And institutions have a different relationship with danger than young shows do. Institutions want to preserve themselves. They want to be loved. They want to be quotable and merchandisable and safe for all demographics. And the shift from dangerous to beloved is where the first rules began to bend, because honesty and belovedness are not always compatible, and when the two came into conflict, the show increasingly chose belovedness. This is not a criticism. This is simply what happened. The same thing happens to almost every long-running creative work. The rawness gets smoothed. The discomfort gets filed down. The portrait becomes a caricature, because caricatures are easier to reproduce, and easier to sell, and easier to watch on a Sunday night when you just want to laugh without being challenged. The rules that broke in The Simpsons were mostly the rules that had been born from that early ambition toward honesty, and what replaced them were the rules of a different kind of show, a show that was still very good and often brilliant but was operating according to a different set of priorities. Tonight we're going to trace that transformation. We are going to follow the breaks in the rules the way you follow cracks in old plaster, running your finger along them to see where they lead, to see what the structure looks like underneath. There is something soothing about this kind of examination when it's done slowly, when you let each contradiction sit for a moment before moving to the next one. When you allow yourself to stay in the world of the show long enough to really feel the texture of what changed and why. The Simpsons is 36 years old. It has 800 episodes. It has given us more fictional hours set in one fictional town than any other show in the history of the medium. That is an enormous amount of world to wander through. And the world is full of beautiful contradictions, full of moments where the rules bent and then broke, and then were quietly rebuilt with different materials. Let's wander through it together. The first specific rule we want to look at is one that most people who grew up watching The Simpsons have a feeling about without necessarily being able to articulate it. It is the rule about what kind of show The Simpsons was. Not what genre it was, because it was always animated satire, but what register it operated in. What level of reality it occupied. In the first 4 seasons, The Simpsons occupied a register that you might call grounded absurdism. The absurdism was there from the start. A cartoon is inherently absurd. Yellow skin is inherently absurd. 4 fingers per hand is inherently absurd. But within those established physical exaggerations, the events of the world were grounded. Real things happened with real consequences. Homer lost his job and it was a crisis. Bart failed a grade and it was a crisis. Marge found a gun in the house and it was handled with the seriousness the situation deserved. The absurdism operated within recognizable human emotional truth. The jokes landed because the emotional context was real. You laughed at Homer's frustration because you understood it. You winced at Bart's recklessness because you knew exactly what that kind of recklessness felt like from the inside. Then, around season 5 and accelerating sharply through seasons 6 and 7, the register shifted. The show began operating higher up on the absurdism scale. The things that happened to Homer started becoming less like exaggerated versions of things that could really happen, and more like pure comedic construction, events that existed solely to be funny rather than to illuminate anything true about the character or the family. Homer went to space. Homer joined the mob. Homer became a food critic. Homer toured with a rock band as a roadie. Homer discovered a long-lost brother, voiced by Danny DeVito, who turned out to be a billionaire, which then had essentially no lasting impact on the family's financial situation. Each of these individually is funny. Each of these in isolation is a reasonable creative choice for an animated show looking to generate novel premises and keep its audience engaged after several seasons. The problem, in terms of the rules, is cumulative. Each extraordinary adventure eroded a little more of the grounded Homer. Each season, the Homer who made mistakes that felt real was further away. The character was becoming a vehicle for premises rather than a person whose specific psychology generated stories. And this is the meta rule that broke first and most consequentially. The rule that characters should generate their stories from within, that the plot should emerge from who the characters are rather than being imposed on the characters from outside by writers who needed a fresh angle. Early Homer stories came from early Homer's specific nature. He was a man who loved his family and was bad at showing it. He was a man with modest talents and immodest appetites. He was a man who wanted to be respected and kept doing things that made respect impossible. His stories were about those specific tensions. Later, Homer's stories were about Homer being placed in an outlandish situation. The outlandish situation was the point. Homer was the vehicle. And that inversion, that shift from character-generated plot to plot imposed on character, is the foundational rule that broke first and enabled everything else to break afterward. Because once you have decided that your characters are vehicles for premises rather than people with coherent psychologies, you have also decided that those characters can be whatever the current premise needs them to be. Their histories can be adjusted. Their established traits can be suspended. Their relationships can be reconfigured. The character is clay now, not stone, and clay will take any shape you press it into. That is the origin point of every rule that broke in The Simpsons. Not any one specific episode, not any one specific creative decision, but that foundational shift in what the characters were for. Once the show decided, gradually and without formal announcement, that the characters were primarily delivery mechanisms for comedy rather than portraits of a specific family, the rules that had been built on the assumption of portraiture became optional, and the show exercised those options enthusiastically and repeatedly for 30 more years. What follows is what that looked like. If you're watching this late at night, or you've got it on in the background while you're getting ready to sleep, go ahead and drop a comment right now, telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see just how far this reaches, the time zones, the countries, the cities, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. It takes 2 seconds and it means you'll always have something long to fall asleep to when you need it. Homer Simpson is one of the most analyzed fictional characters in the history of popular culture. He has been the subject of academic papers examining his as a symbol of the American working class. He has been discussed in philosophy departments as a case study in irrationality and self-defeating behavior. He has been cited in political science courses as evidence of how media shapes our understanding of economic anxiety. Psychologists have written about his impulsivity and his attachment patterns. Economists have noted that his purchasing decisions represent a statistically impossible approach to household budgeting. All of this analysis, all of this serious intellectual attention, was built on a foundation that quietly collapsed somewhere around season 9 and has been in a state of ongoing reconstruction ever since. Because Homer Simpson is not the same character in season 25 that he was in season 2, he is not even particularly close to the same character. If you took the Homer of the first 4 seasons and placed him in an episode from the middle of the show's run, he would seem like a different person wearing a familiar costume. The voice would be the same, the shape would be the same, the color would be the same, but the psychology would be unrecognizable. This transformation is the most dramatic rule-breaking in the entire history of the show, because Homer was the show's central rule. He was the gravitational center around which every other character and story orbited. If you break Homer, you break everything. And the show broke Homer slowly, incrementally, over the course of about 12 years, in a process so gradual that audiences accepted each individual step without objecting, because each individual step looked small from where they were standing. Let's start with what Homer was. Homer J. Simpson in Season 1 and Season 2 was a man in his mid-30s who had made every significant mistake available to a person in his position. He had gotten his girlfriend pregnant in high school, which forced him to abandon his dream of going to college and get a job at the nuclear plant to support his family. He was not happy about this, not all the time, but he had made his peace with it in the way that people make peace with their circumstances, which is to say imperfectly and with periodic eruptions of grief and longing that he did not always know how to manage. He ate too much. He drank too much. He watched too much television. He was not a villain about any of these things. He was simply a man who sought comfort in immediate pleasures because the larger picture of his life was difficult to look at directly for too long. This is an extremely human thing to do. The specific pleasures, donuts and Duff beer, and the couch were funny because of their specificity, but the impulse behind them was universal. He loved his wife with a sincerity that embarrassed him. He expressed this love badly and infrequently and in ways that often backfired. When he managed to express it well, when the show allowed him a moment of genuine tenderness with Marge, it landed with tremendous emotional weight, because it was rare. Rarity is what gives those moments weight. The show understood this. He loved his children with an intensity that he frequently expressed as stupidity. He did not have the emotional vocabulary to say to Bart what he clearly felt, which is that this infuriating, self-destructive, brilliant kid was one of the primary reasons he got out of bed in the morning. What came out instead was frustration and strangling. But underneath the strangling, the love was there, and the show let you see it in the moments between the jokes. This was early Homer, a man made of specific, interconnected traits that formed a coherent whole. Now let's look at what happened. The transformation of Homer Simpson from a coherent, psychological portrait into what the fan community has named, with some precision, Flanderization, after Ned Flanders, who underwent a similar but less severe version of the same process, is one of the most documented phenomena in long-form television studies. The term Flanderization itself, now used across all fields of media criticism to describe the process by which a complex character gets reduced to an exaggerated version of their most easily reproducible trait, originated in discussions about The Simpsons and about what the show did to its own characters over time. The process with Homer went something like this. Homer's most comedically exploitable trait was his impulsive stupidity. Not his deep stupidity, not clinical intellectual disability, but the specific kind of impulsivity that makes a person choose the funny option even when the sensible option is sitting right there, clearly labeled. Early Homer had this trait. It was one of many, but it was the funniest one, the one that generated the most reliable laugh responses, the one that could be deployed quickly and efficiently when an episode needed momentum. So the writers used it, more and more. And as they used it more, the other traits, the tenderness, the self-awareness, the specific working-class anxieties, had less room to operate. They did not disappear overnight. They faded. Like a photograph left in sunlight, the colors shift so slowly that on any given day the change is imperceptible. You only notice when you hold the current version next to the original, and the gap suddenly becomes visible. By season 8 or 9, Homer's impulsive stupidity had expanded to fill most of the available space in his characterization. He was still capable of tender moments. The show never completely abandoned those, but they existed now as interruptions to the buffoonery rather than as expressions of an underlying humanity that the buffoonery was obscuring. The ratio had inverted, and as the ratio inverted, the show had to keep escalating the buffoonery to maintain the comedy. Because comedy that depends on transgression of established character expectations requires either that the expectations remain stable, so the transgressions feel fresh, or that the transgressions keep getting larger to compensate for the audience's adaptation. The Simpsons chose escalation. This is where Homer stopped being human in a meaningful sense. The inflection point, the moment where the gradual becomes the dramatic, is most often cited by fans and critics as the season 5 episode called Homer Goes to College, written by Conan O'Brien, which aired in October of 1993. This is the episode where Homer explicitly declares his understanding of college to be based entirely on the film Animal House, which leads to a series of escalating misunderstandings with the actual college environment. The episode is very funny. Conan O'Brien wrote some of the greatest Simpsons episodes during his brief tenure on the writing staff, and Homer Goes to College is among the best of them. But it is also the clearest early articulation of a Homer who is responding not to reality but to a pop culture template of what he thinks reality should look like. He is not a person navigating a situation. He is a cartoon of a person who learned everything he knows about situations from other cartoons. That recursive quality, Homer as a character who processes the world through media templates rather than direct experience, is both very funny and quietly corrosive of the original rules. Because the original Homer processed the world through direct experience. The original Homer's mistakes were the mistakes of a man bumping into reality with insufficient equipment. They were comprehensible from the inside. The new Homer's mistakes were the mistakes of a man bumping into reality with the wrong template entirely, and that is a different kind of mistake. It is funnier in certain ways and much less humanly relatable in others. From Homer Goes to College forward, the trajectory is clear. Homer becomes progressively more governed by his most exaggerated traits and progressively less governed by the coherent psychology underneath them. By the time the show reaches its middle seasons, roughly 10 through 15, Homer has become something that the show handles by essentially ignoring the rules about his character entirely on an episode-by-episode basis. One episode, Homer will display a vulnerability so precise and so rooted in his specific history, his absent mother, his difficult relationship with his father, his terror of being unloved, that it feels like the early show. Another episode the same week will have Homer doing something so colossally stupid and consequence-free that the character seems to share nothing with the Homer who felt those specific vulnerabilities. And the show does not reconcile these two Homers. It just cuts between them as the story requires. This leads to what might be the most specific and documentable instance of the show breaking its own rules around Homer's character. The running logic of Homer's intelligence. In the early seasons, Homer's intelligence is established at a fairly specific level. He is not a genius. He is not even above average. He is a man of average or slightly below average intelligence who was never particularly encouraged academically and whose intellectual potential was never fully developed, partly due to circumstances and partly due to his own choices. He is capable of genuine insight when the situation calls for it. He can learn things. He can be surprised by complexity and moved by it. He is not, in the early seasons, someone whose stupidity seems like a medical condition. Season 12 changed this with an episode called OMR, spelled without the final E, which stands for the Home Observation Monitoring Reel Experiment. But the title is really a setup for the reveal. In this episode, Homer has a crayon surgically removed from his brain, a crayon that has apparently been lodged there since childhood, and upon its removal, Homer's IQ rises dramatically and he becomes suddenly and recognizably brilliant. He reads books. He thinks in complex sentences. He processes consequences before acting on impulse. He is, for one episode, the person he might have been. And then he has the crayon put back. Because being smart in Springfield is unbearable. Because intelligence isolates you in a community that does not reward intelligence. Because Homer loves his family more than he loves the clarity of mind that lets him see his family clearly, and he cannot have both. This is a beautiful episode. It is emotionally intelligent and genuinely moving in ways that the later seasons rarely managed. But it also retroactively changed the rule about Homer's intelligence in ways the show did not fully process. Because once you establish that Homer's stupidity is the result of a foreign object in his brain rather than a natural expression of his character, you have made a very specific claim about what Homer could be. You have said that the comedy, all the years of Homer being funny because he was impulsive and dim, was built on a character who was not actually like that, who was being held back artificially, who was capable, underneath the crayon, of the same insight and self-awareness that the show had been periodically granting him in emotional episodes before immediately taking back. The rules, in other words, contradicted themselves. The show had been writing Homer as a man with limited but genuine intelligence for 12 years. Then it revealed that his limited intelligence was the result of a crayon, which implied that the rule about his intelligence had never been stable at all. And then the crayon went back in, and the show continued as if the revelation had not happened. The Homer of season 13 is not written as a man who chose to be less intelligent. He is written as the same slightly dimmer than average character he always was, with no acknowledgement that a specific structural decision was made to keep him that way. The show broke its own rule about Homer's intelligence, established a new rule about why he was the way he was, and then quietly discarded the new rule while keeping the original presentation. 3 different versions of the same fact about the same character, none of them fully compatible with the others. This is the pattern. This is what makes the Homer transformation such a rich example of the show's relationship with its own rules. It is not that the show changed Homer. It is that the show changed Homer in multiple contradictory directions simultaneously, and then acted as if all the versions were consistent with each other. There is another dimension to this that is worth sitting with on a quiet night. The dimension that is less about comedy and more about what Homer represented as a cultural figure. Homer Simpson in the late 80s and early 90s was a genuinely progressive depiction of American masculinity, in the specific sense that he was not aspirational. He was not a fantasy of what fathers could be. He was a documentation of what fathers often were. He struggled to communicate emotionally. He prioritized his own comfort in ways that cost his family. He repeated his mistakes because his self-awareness, though present, could not consistently overcome his impulses. These were not admirable traits, but depicting them honestly, without condemning Homer entirely and without excusing him entirely, was doing something useful. It was saying that this kind of man exists, that he is capable of love, and that the love does not automatically fix the flaws, and that the flaws do not cancel the love. As Homer became more cartoonishly stupid and more consequence-free in his idiocy, that honest portrait faded. The Homer who strangled Bart became a cartoon gag rather than a depiction of impulsive parental frustration. The Homer who chose beer over family became a visual punchline rather than a portrait of avoidance. The show stopped asking us to recognize Homer. It started asking us to find him funny, which is a much lower bar and produces a much less nourishing experience. The rule that Homer broke, ultimately, was the rule of recognition. Early Homer was recognizable, later Homer was funny. These are not the same thing, and the show spent 30 years slowly trading the first for the second. The trading was not without its rewards. The funny Homer generated some of the show's most quoted moments, most memorable visual gags, most enduring catchphrases. The show did not get worse in every dimension when Homer got funnier, but it got less honest. And honesty was the original rule. There is one more specific instance of Homer-related rule-breaking that deserves particular attention, because it involves not just who Homer is, but what Homer is physically capable of. And this is where the rule-breaking becomes almost philosophical. Homer's physical resilience in the later seasons is essentially infinite. He has been hit by cars, fallen from great heights, been electrocuted, been on fire, been crushed, been poisoned, swallowed by large marine animals, ejected from aircraft, and exposed to radiation at levels that would be immediately fatal to any actual human being. He recovers from all of these things, usually within the same episode and sometimes within the same scene. In the early seasons, Homer's physical comedy was grounded. The injuries he sustained were exaggerated but existed on the same scale as cartoon physics generally allow. A fall would hurt. A punch would disorient him. He was not invincible. He was just resistant in the way that cartoon characters need to be resistant to allow for physical comedy. In the later seasons, the scale of what Homer could survive began to expand without limit. This is its own kind of rule-breaking. Not a rule about character psychology, but about the physical logic of the world the show inhabits. The world of early Simpsons had consistent physics. Things hurt appropriately. Danger was actually dangerous. When Homer was in peril, there was some level of genuine tension because the physics of that world suggested consequences were possible. The world of later Simpsons operates on a different physical logic entirely. Homer can survive anything. This has become its own kind of rule, a new rule that replaced the old one without announcement. And the new rule, while it enables certain kinds of physical comedy, also eliminates one of the things that made Homer compelling as a character, which is that he was vulnerable. A person who can survive anything is not exactly a person. He is a force. And forces are entertaining, but they are not sympathetic in the way that vulnerable people are sympathetic. This shift in Homer's physical vulnerability is a rule that broke so slowly and so completely that the original rule is now almost unrecoverable. If you watch an early episode where Homer is hurt by something that would genuinely hurt, and then watch a late episode where Homer absorbs damage that would kill a small army and then brushes himself off, you are watching two different shows that share a title and a character name. The rules broke. The Homer that remained is funnier in many ways and less meaningful in almost all of the ways that matter for how a fictional character lives in your memory. And that trade is the central bargain of the show's long run. The one the show made with itself and never publicly acknowledged making. We will come back to Homer throughout this script, because every section of the show's rule-breaking touches him in some way. But for now, let's let him rest on his couch with his duff and his television, and let's turn our attention to the thing that makes all the other broken rules possible. The timeline. Time in Springfield works the way it works in dreams. In a dream, you can be in your childhood home and also simultaneously in a city you visited once when you were 23, and the two locations do not contradict each other, because dreams do not require spatial logic. Things are where the story needs them to be. Chronology is a suggestion. The past is not fixed, but flexible, reshaping itself to serve whatever emotional experience the dream is constructing in the moment. Springfield works the same way, and the more time you spend in Springfield, the more clearly you can feel the dream logic operating underneath the surface realism of the animation. The floating timeline? which is the technical term for the narrative strategy the show employs to keep its characters from aging while letting the world around them continue to change, is not itself a broken rule. It is a rule, a deliberate creative decision made early in the show's life and consistently applied. The characters do not age. The present is always the present. The year in which an episode airs is the year in which the episode's events take place, and the characters experience those events at the same age they were in the previous episode, which was set in a different year. This is fine. This is how animated shows work. Nobody expects Bart to turn 11. What is not fine, or at least what is genuinely strange and worth examining, is what happens to the past when you apply this strategy over the course of 36 years. Because the characters do not age, but they do have histories. They have parents and childhoods and formative experiences, and the specific stories of how they came to be the people they are. And those histories, unlike the characters themselves, are not frozen. They cannot be frozen, because if they were, the show would be unable to reference its characters' pasts at all without immediately exposing the absurdity of the timeline. If Homer and Marge are always in their mid-30s and the show always takes place in whatever year it's currently airing, then their high school years must also always be in whatever era corresponds to them being teenagers roughly 20 years earlier. In 1989, that means Homer and Marge went to high school in the late 1960s or early 1970s. In 2025, that means they went to high school in the early 2010s. The problem is that the show established, in a series of flashback episodes during its early seasons, very specific details about Homer and Marge's adolescence. Details that are explicitly anchored to the era of the late 60s and early 70s. The music, the fashion, the cultural references, the specific events that shaped who they became. These details are not generic, they are specific. They are part of the texture of who Homer and Marge are as people. And so, as the floating timeline dragged the present forward, those specific historical details became contradictions. The show had to either pretend the contradictions did not exist, which it mostly did, or periodically issue new versions of Homer and Marge's shared history that were updated to reflect a more recent adolescent era. The show did both, sometimes in the same season. The most direct version of this problem is in the episode called The Way We Was, which aired in January of 1991 and told the story of how Homer and Marge met in high school. The episode is set in 1974. It is specific about this. The fashions are specific. The hairstyles are specific. The music playing at the prom is specific. The political backdrop, Watergate, the end of Vietnam, the specific anxieties of the American mid-70s, is woven into the fabric of the story. This episode established the official history of Homer and Marge's relationship. This was the canonical backstory. These were the rules of their shared past. But if you are watching The Simpsons in 2025 and Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s, then they did not go to high school in 1974. They went to high school in approximately 2007. The episode The Way We Was is, within the current logic of the show's timeline, a historical document about events that did not occur. It is a fiction within a fiction, a past that the present has quietly made impossible. The show did not ignore this problem. It engaged with it, several times, by producing new flashback episodes that updated the origin story to fit a more contemporary adolescent setting. In Season 31, the episode Screenless aired and included flashback sequences depicting a Homer and Marge adolescence that bore essentially no resemblance to the 1974 setting of The Way We Was. The details were different. The era was different. The entire cultural context was different. The show had produced two mutually exclusive origin stories for its two central characters, both presented as canonical, both treated by the episode that contained them as the true version of events. The rules of the past had been broken by the mechanics of the present. This is interesting on its own, but it becomes genuinely vertiginous when you consider the full scope of what the drifting timeline has done to the show's historical continuity. Homer's backstory contains references to his military service at some point in the show's run. It contains references to specific historical events that are anchored to specific decades. It contains references to Abe Simpson's World War II service, which gives Homer a father old enough to have fought in a war that ended in 1945, and yet Homer's father is never depicted as being biologically implausible in relation to Homer's age. Abe is old. He is very old. But he is not impossibly old, and the show periodically requires him to be in order for the math of the floating timeline to work. Because if Homer is always in his mid-30s, and the present is always the present, then Homer was born roughly 20 years before the current episode aired. In 2025, Homer was born in approximately 2005. But Abe served in World War II, which ended in 1945. Abe would need to be well over 100 years old to be Homer's biological father, which the show does not depict and never acknowledges. The math simply does not work. The timeline ate itself. The show's solution to this problem, which it never articulates but consistently practices, is to treat the past as a zone where normal logic does not apply. Flashbacks are impressionistic. They evoke an era without committing to its exact date. References to historical events are made casually, without worrying too much about whether they are compatible with the other references in the same episode or the same season. The past is not a fixed record. It is a palette from which the writers draw when they need to illustrate something about a character, and the colors are chosen for expressive effect rather than historical consistency. This approach works well enough that most viewers do not notice the contradictions unless they are actively looking for them. The show has a texture of historicity, a feeling that these characters have pasts that matter and that those pasts are rooted in real historical time. And that texture is maintained, even though the specific details of those pasts are often mutually exclusive. But there is a specific category of timeline contradiction that cuts deeper than simple historical anachronism. This is the category of character-defining events that the timeline has rendered impossible, and yet which the show continues to invoke as part of its character's emotional architecture. The most striking example involves Bart. In the episode Bart Gets Famous, which aired in Season 5, Bart experiences a brief moment of celebrity after becoming associated with a catchphrase that takes over the cultural conversation. The episode is a satire of instant fame and its hollow rewards. It is a good episode, but embedded within it is a detail that becomes increasingly contradictory as the timeline drifts forward. The episode was set in 1994. Bart is 10 years old. The cultural references in the episode are specific to that era. The nature of fame and media attention that the episode satirizes is specifically the fame of the early to mid-90s, before the internet changed the mechanics of celebrity so completely. But Bart is still 10 years old in 2025, which means the experience depicted in Bart Gets Famous either happened when Bart was 10 in 2025, which would require the episode's satire to somehow still be relevant to a fundamentally different media landscape, or it happened in some unspecified floating past that is never quite anchored to a real year, which is the show's actual strategy, but which also means the episode's specific cultural grounding is a kind of fiction. The event still happened, in the show's logic, but when they happened is impossible to say. The timeline both preserves the events and makes their temporal location undeterminable, which means the events exist in a kind of floating present tense that is neither the past nor the present, but some hybrid state that only Springfield's peculiar relationship with time could produce. This is the timeline eating itself. It is the show's temporal logic consuming its own continuity, generating contradictions that the show then lives inside of, going about its business among the wreckage of its own past without acknowledging that the wreckage is there. And there is a specific episode that makes this explicit in a way that the show probably did not intend, but that is impossible to ignore once you see it. The episode is called Bart vs. Australia, from Season 6, and it involves the Simpson family traveling to Australia after Bart causes an international incident by making a collect call. The episode is primarily a satire of Australian culture and of American cultural imperialism. It is funny and broad and contains some of the show's best visual gags. But it also contains something stranger. In the episode, the passage of time is treated as essentially irrelevant. The family travels to Australia. Events unfold. The family returns. And the return is treated with the same casual non-acknowledgement of consequence that characterizes the show's relationship with the timeline generally. Bart committed an act with international diplomatic repercussions. He was punished in a fairly severe way by Australian authorities. The family was involved in a minor international incident. They come home, and by the next episode, none of it is mentioned. The rule that the world should remember consequential events was broken so completely and so casually in this episode that the breaking felt almost like a declaration. The show was not going to be governed by the weight of its own history. The timeline was going to remain a suggestion Events would happen, and then they would not have happened, not because they were erased, but because no one in Springfield was going to acknowledge them. This is a specific form of rule-breaking that the show practiced across its entire run, but that becomes most visible around events of genuine magnitude. The family went to Australia. The family was involved in a diplomatic incident. The family returned to Springfield, and Springfield did not care. Springfield never cares about its own history, and this is, as we discussed in the first section, one of the show's most consistent internal logics, the logic of collective forgetting that allows a town built on impossible contradictions to continue functioning. But it also breaks the rule about time, the rule that events have duration and sequence, and that the order in which things happen matters. In Springfield, the order of events matters only within a single episode. Between episodes, the slate wipes clean. Time resets. The past becomes inaccessible, not because it is forgotten, but because the show has decided that accessing it is optional. There is something genuinely strange about sitting with this for a long time. The Simpsons has produced more story, more accumulated narrative time, more fictional hours set in one fictional world than essentially any other television show in history. And almost none of that accumulated story is accessible to the characters who lived it. They cannot remember the things that happened to them because the show does not allow them to remember. They live in a permanent present that is entirely populated by the present episode and nothing else. From the outside, from the perspective of the audience, the history is all there. It exists in syndication and streaming and DVD and the memories of people who grew up watching. From the inside, from the perspective of the characters, it might as well not have happened. Homer went to space. But Homer's sense of himself as a person who went to space does not inform his psychology in any subsequent episode. Bart made a friend who moved away. But Bart's sense of himself as someone who has experienced loss does not accumulate into a portrait of a child dealing with the specific loneliness of childhood friendships that end. Lisa played saxophone at a memorial for an important musician who died. But Lisa's sense of herself as someone who has experienced grief does not become part of who she is in the next episode. The timeline ate the emotional history. It ate the consequences. It ate the accumulation of experience that, in a real person, would have built a specific and recognizable self over time. In Springfield, the self is reset with the timeline. Every week there is a version of Homer who has never been to space. Every week there is a Bart who has never lost a friend. Every week there is a Lisa who has not yet experienced the particular grief of caring deeply in a world that does not care back. The rule that characters should be shaped by their histories was broken by a timeline that could not allow histories to accumulate without destroying the fiction of the permanent present. And there is one more dimension to the timeline's self-consumption that is worth examining, because it involves not just the characters' pasts, but their futures. The show has, on several occasions, produced episodes set in a speculative future. The most famous and most beloved is the Season 6 episode called Lisa's Wedding, which depicts a possible future in which Lisa is 23 years old and engaged to be married to a young Englishman named Hugh. The episode was set approximately 15 years in the future from the episode's 1995 air date, which would place it around 2010. The future it depicted was detailed and specific. Technology had changed, the family had aged, though not uniformly or with complete plausibility. The cultural landscape of Springfield had evolved. And most significantly, the relationships between the characters had deepened and changed in ways that felt emotionally true to who those characters were likely to become. Lisa at 23 was recognizably extrapolated from Lisa at 8. The things that mattered to 8-year-old Lisa were still the things that mattered to 23-year-old Lisa, refined and complicated by the intervening years. This episode is often cited as one of the show's most emotionally resonant achievements. It is the show at its best, which is to say at its most honest. It is a show looking at itself clearly and imagining, with genuine insight, what these characters would become if they were allowed to become anything. But 2010 came and went, and Lisa was still 8 years old. The future that the episode depicted was a future that the floating timeline rendered impossible the moment real-time caught up to it. 2010 arrived, and Springfield was still in the permanent present of whatever year the current episode happened to be airing. The specific future of Lisa's wedding was now in the past, and it had not happened. The rules of the floating timeline consumed even the show's most emotional engagement with the possibility of its characters changing over time. The timeline ate that too. It ate the future it had imagined and left only the permanent present in its place. And so we are left with a show that inhabits a kind of temporal bubble. The past is contradictory, the future is impossible, the present is eternal, and the characters inside the bubble live without memory or anticipation, experiencing each episode as if it were the first and last thing that has ever happened to them, which, in a sense, within the rules of the floating timeline, it is. This is not a comfortable place to live, but it is, in its strange way, a very specific and recognizable human experience. The experience of feeling trapped in a present that will not move, that will not allow the past to teach you and will not allow the future to arrive. That is what the floating timeline creates for its characters, and it is one of the reasons the show, despite all its rule-breaking, continues to resonate. The characters are stuck in a way that is funny. They are also stuck in a way that is true. And the truth underneath the comedy is something that the broken timeline both obscures and reveals. Let's move on to geography. Because if you think the timeline is strange, wait until you try to put Springfield on a map. There is a map of Springfield that fans have assembled over the years, piecing together the spatial relationships between locations as established across hundreds of episodes, drawing lines between the nuclear plant and the school and the bar and the church and the tire fire and the various mountains and coastlines and deserts that the show has at various times placed within commuting distance of the town's center. The map is beautiful. It is also completely impossible. Springfield has, at various points in its 36 years of existence, been located on a coast, on a landlocked plain, near mountains, in a desert, in a temperate forest, adjacent to a major river, near a gorge, near a canyon, on the border of a neighboring state, on the border of 4 different neighboring states simultaneously depending on which episode you're watching. It has had a harbor, it has had a beach, it has had snowfall so heavy it recalled the northeast of America, and heat waves so severe they recalled the southwest. It has had an active volcano within reasonable driving distance. It has had farmland extending to the horizon in every direction. No single location in the United States has all of these geographic features simultaneously. The United States is a large country with great geographic variety, but it is not a country that allows any single town to have ocean access, desert proximity, mountains, farmland, gorges, volcanoes, and a temperate climate all within the same county. Springfield does not exist in America. Springfield exists in some compression of America, some spatial folding that has brought every possible American landscape into adjacency with every other possible American landscape, creating a town that can be whatever the current episode's visual requirements demand without ever committing to a fixed position in the actual geography of the actual country. The rule that was broken here is the rule of spatial consistency. Early Springfield had a spatial logic. You could orient yourself within it. The power plant was to the north, or at least it was consistently in one direction. The school had a specific relationship to the Simpson home. The bar was a walkable distance from the house. The geography was not photorealistic, but it was consistent. You developed an intuitive sense of where things were in relation to each other, the way you develop an intuitive sense of a real neighborhood you spend time in. Then, the spatial logic dissolved. Not dramatically, not in one episode where the show announced that it was going to start placing locations wherever the story needed them, but gradually, as the show's ambitions for individual episodes outgrew its commitment to a consistent spatial world. An episode that needed a beach put Springfield on the coast. An episode that needed a mountain put a mountain within sight of the town. An episode that needed a desert heat wave put Springfield in the southwest. And none of these placements were ever reconciled with the previous placements, because reconciliation would require a kind of editorial review that the show did not practice and may not have been capable of at the rate it was producing episodes. The result is a town with no fixed geography, and the interesting thing about this is that it mirrors, with almost suspicious precision, the show's relationship with its own timeline. Just as the timeline is a floating present that refuses to anchor itself to any fixed year, the geography is a floating space that refuses to anchor itself to any fixed location. Time and space in Springfield both operate according to the principle of whatever the story needs right now, without reference to what was established before. This is a specific kind of rule-breaking that deserves its own analysis, because the rule it breaks is not just a technical continuity rule but a rule about what kind of fictional world the show inhabits. When a story establishes a consistent physical world, it is making a claim about the nature of that world. It is saying that the world operates according to recognizable laws of physics and geography, that things are where they are for comprehensible reasons, that the spatial relationships between locations are fixed and stable and will remain so unless a specific narrative event changes them. This claim creates a feeling of reality. Not full reality, not documentary reality, but the kind of reality that allows the audience to believe in the world well enough to care about the people who live in it. When that spatial consistency breaks down, the nature of the world changes. It becomes more like a stage than a location. The sets can be moved between scenes. The backdrop can be switched. The audience is no longer quite in Springfield. They are in a performance of Springfield, a version of the town assembled for each episode's specific requirements and then struck at the end of shooting. Most audiences accept this intuitively without articulating it, because animated television has always operated closer to the stage set model than live-action television. But The Simpsons, in its early seasons, was unusually committed to the location model rather than the stage set model. The geography had that groundedness quality that the characters had, and losing the groundedness of the space, accelerated the loss of groundedness in everything else. There is one specific geographic rule that the show broke in a way so flagrant that it became a long-running joke among fans, which is the location of the gorge. Springfield has a gorge. It is variously called Springfield Gorge and the Springfield Gorge, and it appears in the episode Bart the Daredevil in Season 2, when Homer attempts to jump the gorge on a skateboard and achieves one of the most prolonged and spectacular slapstick injuries in the show's history. He falls into the gorge. He bounces down the cliff face. He slides across rocks. He is airlifted by helicopter and then falls again when the helicopter door opens. It is a masterwork of physical comedy built on the specific geography of a fixed location. Springfield Gorge thereafter became an occasional reference point. The gorge was there. It was a real place in the show's physical world, with a specific established character, steep sides, certain geological features, a particular relationship to the rest of Springfield's landscape. And then the gorge started appearing in different places. Its distance from the town changed. Its dimensions changed. Its accessibility changed. In later episodes, characters are at the gorge in what should be a very short period of time from having been somewhere else entirely, which would only be possible if the gorge had moved, or if the spatial relationships between Springfield's locations had been silently renegotiated. The gorge is a small example, but it is representative of a much larger pattern. Every fixed geographical feature in Springfield is ultimately negotiable. Everything that was established as permanent is actually provisional, subject to relocation or rescaling whenever the story requires it. The gorge is where the story needs the gorge to be. Everything else is where the story needs it to. Now, having said all of this, there is something I want to acknowledge about the geographic rule breaking that differs from the other kinds of rule breaking we've discussed. The other breaks, the character breaks, the timeline breaks, they represent losses. The Homer who broke his character rules is a less compelling Homer than the early Homer. The timeline that ate itself is a less emotionally satisfying temporal structure than the early season's more grounded chronology. But the geographic impossibility of Springfield is, in a strange way, one of the show's greatest features. It is a feature that feels like a bug only if you are committed to the show as realistic portrait rather than as mythological landscape. Because Springfield's geographic impossibility is what makes it universal. The show's creator, Matt Groening, has said that he chose the name Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America, a name that appears in dozens of states, a name that belongs to everywhere and therefore to nowhere specific. This was always the intention. Springfield was meant to feel familiar to every American viewer regardless of their actual geography, and the way to make a place feel familiar to everyone is to make it contain elements of everywhere. You cannot put Springfield on a real map because Springfield is not a real place. It is a synthesis of every American place. It is the town everyone grew up in, assembled from the specific buildings and landscapes and atmospheres of hundreds of actual towns, folded into one impossible location that sits outside real geography entirely. When you understand the show's geography this way, the rule-breaking looks different. It was not carelessness. It was design. The spatial inconsistency was always in service of the show's most fundamental aspiration, which was to create a town that every American could claim as their own. But the design was purchased at a cost. The cost was the specific groundedness of a place that you could orient yourself within, that you could navigate in your imagination, that you could feel the way you feel your own neighborhood. That specificity was traded for universality. The real location was traded for the mythological location, and the show's relationship with its own geography became, as a result, permanently ambiguous, permanently negotiable, permanently subject to the overriding demand of whatever the current story needed from the space. That ambiguity is one of the show's most characterful qualities. It is also unmistakably a broken rule, and the breaking of it, the willingness to let the place be whatever the story needed it to be rather than committing to a fixed world, modeled for the show's writers an approach to the other rules that would eventually break those too. Geography was where Springfield first learned it could be anything. Time was where it learned it could be any when. And character was where it learned it could be anyone. Each broken rule taught the show that rules were optional, and each optional rule made the next one easier to break. This is the feedback loop of The Simpsons' 36 years. Each creative freedom enabled a larger creative freedom. Each abandoned constraint made the next constraint easier to abandon. And the show's world, as a result, is simultaneously enormous and weightless, vast in its scope and thin in its specific gravity. We are going to keep returning to that tension between enormity and weightlessness as we go. But first, let's talk about the dead. People die in Springfield. They die with some regularity. They die in main plots and background gags and Treehouse of Horror specials, and occasionally in ways that are clearly meant to be canon, but are then quietly forgotten by everyone involved. The rule about death, as established in the early seasons, was that death was permanent. The early Simpsons treated mortality with the same grounded honesty that it brought to its other subject matter. When a character died, they stayed dead. Their absence had weight. The living characters felt the absence in ways that persisted beyond the episode in which the death occurred. The clearest example of this early rule is the death of Bleeding Gums Murphy, Lisa's jazz musician mentor, in the season 6 episode called Round Springfield. Murphy has appeared several times before this episode, always as a genuinely realized secondary character rather than a background prop. His death in the episode is handled with real emotional care. Lisa grieves. Her grief is specific and full of the particular quality of grief for someone whose significance to you was not widely recognized by others, the grief of a private loss. The episode does not flinch from the weight of his absence, and after Murphy's death he stays dead. He does not return. He does not appear in flashbacks that feel like cheats. When the show references his influence on Lisa in later episodes, it does so carefully, in a way that honors the permanence of his absence rather than undercutting it. This is the rule working correctly. Death has weight. The dead stay dead. Their absence shapes the living. Then the rule started breaking. The breaking of the death rule in The Simpsons is not as simple as characters who die coming back to life, though that does happen. It is more complex than that. It is a gradual erosion of death's significance as a narrative event, a process by which the weight of mortality was reduced first to a plot device, then to a joke, then to something that happens in the background of a scene and is never acknowledged. The most famous instance of this erosion is not a specific character death, but a specific character's relationship with death as a recurring experience. Hans Moleman, the elderly, nearly blind Springfield resident who exists primarily to suffer, has died on camera in the show's canon episodes, not in Treehouse of Horror specials where all bets are off, more times than any other character in the show's history. He has been crushed, incinerated, drowned, burned, buried, eaten by animals, and driven over by vehicles. He has been killed in background shots in episodes where nobody even acknowledges that a man just died in the corner of the frame. And then he shows up in the next episode, alive, ready to be killed again. Now, in the Treehouse of Horror universe, this makes sense. Those episodes operate on explicitly horror comedy logic, where death is theatrical and temporary, and the audience understands that the rules of the regular show are suspended. But Moleman's deaths in canon episodes are a different matter entirely. They occur in the regular show's logic. They are presented, visually, as real. A person dies, and then the show does not acknowledge that it happened. The rule that was broken by Moleman's deaths is not just the permanence of death rule, but the internal consistency of the world rule. If people can die in Springfield and then simply appear again without explanation, then the world of Springfield does not operate according to the same laws as the world the show was originally set in. The world of the original show, the world of the first 4 seasons, did not allow people to die and then reappear. Death was an end, Now death is an episode. The Molman phenomenon is the most extreme and most frequently cited example, but it is not the only one. The show's approach to death has varied widely over its run, and the variation is itself a kind of rule-breaking. The show does not have a consistent policy about what death means in its world. Sometimes it means the same thing it means in the real world, a permanent and irreversible absence that shapes the lives of those who remain. Sometimes it means something closer to what it means in a Looney Tunes cartoon, a temporary condition that resolves itself between scenes, and sometimes it means nothing at all. The inconsistency is the rule that broke. The rule was not specifically that death must always be permanent. The rule was that the show must have a consistent relationship with death, that the audience should be able to predict how the show will treat mortality based on how it has treated mortality before. When that consistency dissolves, when you never quite know whether a death in this episode will stick or will be cheerfully ignored in the next one, the stakes of every potentially fatal situation drop to zero. There are no stakes if you cannot predict what the show will do with the consequences. The most emotionally significant test of this rule came with the death of Maud Flanders. Maud Flanders, the wife of Ned Flanders and mother of Rod and Todd, was killed in the season 11 episode called Alone Again, Natura Diddley, which aired in February of 2000. The death was precipitated by real-world circumstances. The actress who voiced Maud, Maggie Roswell, had left the show over a salary dispute. Rather than recast the character, the writers decided to kill her, to make her absence canonical and permanent. The episode is, in several respects, handled with genuine care. Maud dies at a NASCAR race when a t-shirt cannon fires a barrage of shirts at Homer, who ducks, and the shirts hit Maud and knock her from the bleachers. It is an absurd death in a show that has always balanced absurdity with emotional truth. The absurdity of the cause does not undercut the seriousness of the event itself. What follows in the episode is a portrait of Ned Flanders grieving, and it is one of the show's most honest depictions of bereavement. Ned's faith is shaken. His relationship with God, which has always been one of his defining characteristics, is called into question by the randomness and injustice of the loss. He struggles. He seeks comfort and finds it inadequate. He is, for one episode, a man in genuine pain that his spiritual framework cannot fully contain. Then the show moved on, and the moving on is where the rules got interesting. Because Maud stayed dead, the show honored her death, in the sense that it never reversed it. Ned remained a widower. His sons grew up without a mother. The specific loss was not undone. In this respect, the show followed the original death rule. Death was permanent. Absence had weight. But the weight, over time, became selectively applied. Ned Flanders moved on in ways that sometimes felt emotionally authentic, and sometimes felt like the show was using Maud's death as a plot device, as a premise generator, as a way of putting Ned into dating situations that provided comedic material. The grief became a feature of his character rather than a living wound. It became the thing that explained his dating life rather than the thing that explained his daily experience of absence. This is a subtle kind of rule-breaking. The permanence of the death was honored, but the weight of the death, the ongoing texture of what it means to have lost a life partner suddenly and absurdly and without the chance to say goodbye, was gradually reduced from the center of Ned's psychology to a background detail. The death was kept. The grief was archived. And this is perhaps the most honest thing the show ever did with its death rule, because this is how grief actually works in long-running human lives. It does not maintain its full initial weight indefinitely. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are rather than something you are actively feeling every moment. The grief gets incorporated, but the show's depiction of this process was not entirely honest, because it was also driven by the demands of comedy writing in a way that authentic grief is not. Ned's dating storylines after Maud's death were primarily comic premises that happened to require a recently widowed character. The emotional truth of his loss was present enough to give those stories some texture, but secondary enough to allow the comedy to operate freely. The grief was real but also convenient. The rule that broke was the rule of emotional consistency. The show could not be both genuinely honest about Ned's grief and also use that grief freely as a premise generator. The two demands pulled in opposite directions, and the show, as it always does when two demands pull in opposite directions, resolved the tension by doing both things without quite acknowledging that they were in tension. There is one more death-related rule that broke in a way worth discussing, and it is less about specific characters than about a general policy shift in how the show treats fatal danger. In the early seasons, when a character was in physical danger, there was a feeling of genuine stakes. The show's world operated according to physics, realistic enough that you could not be entirely certain the character would emerge unharmed. The tension was real because the consequences were possible. In the later seasons, particularly after Homer's invincibility became an established feature of the show's comedy, the stakes of fatal danger dropped to essentially nothing. When Homer was in a situation that would kill a normal person, the audience had learned to expect survival. Not because the show had established a rule that Homer cannot die, but because the show had demonstrated, repeatedly, that it was not interested in following through on the premise that Homer's situations were genuinely dangerous. The rule that broke was the rule of meaningful stakes. Early Springfield was a world where bad things could happen, and did happen, and stayed happened. Later Springfield was a world where bad things happened at the start of an episode and resolved comfortably by the end. A world where the formula of return to normal was so reliable that it eliminated the creative possibility of not returning to normal. And the elimination of that possibility, the elimination of the genuine risk of permanent change, is the deepest rule-breaking in the show's history of broken rules. Because without genuine risk, stories cannot fully work. Stories require that something real might be at stake. When the audience knows that nothing will truly change, that the characters will survive and return and reset, the stories become something slightly less than stories. They become entertainment that operates without the fundamental tension that makes stories meaningful. The show built this for itself. It built it over decades of reset buttons and returned to normal and survived improbable danger. It built a world where nothing sticks, where death does not stay dead, where consequences dissolve like sugar in rain. And having built that world, it found itself unable to do the thing that stories need most, which is to mean something by what happens. The deaths that didn't stick were symptoms of this. Each unstuck death was the show betting against itself, betting that the comedy of the reset was worth more than the gravity of the consequence, betting that audiences would find the lightness charming rather than hollow. Sometimes the bet paid off, sometimes the lightness was exactly right for what the show was trying to do in that moment. But over time, as the bets accumulated, the lightness became the permanent condition, and the gravity, the weight that made the early show feel true and important and worth caring about, became something you had to go looking for specifically, rather than something that was simply there. Let's talk about the characters who changed the most. Because the dead who came back are one kind of rule-breaking, but the living who became different people are another kind entirely. Character consistency is one of the most fundamental rules of serialized fiction. The rule is simple, and the reasoning behind it is simple. Audiences form attachments to fictional characters based on their understanding of who those characters are. The understanding builds over time, through hundreds of small observations, reactions, choices, failures, recoveries. The accumulated understanding is what makes a character feel real. And what makes an audience care about a character is the combination of understanding who they are and being invested in what happens to them. When a character changes without the change being earned, when a character behaves differently from how they were established to behave without the narrative doing the work of showing you why they changed, the understanding breaks. The character stops feeling real. The attachment phrase. The audience is left with a character wearing the name and face of someone they knew, but not quite being that person anymore. The Simpsons did this to several of its characters. It did it more thoroughly to some than others. It did it with varying degrees of intentionality. And in a few cases, it did it in ways that were so complete and so sustained that the original character is essentially inaccessible now, without going back to the specific early episodes in which that character lived. The character who underwent the most dramatic rewriting was Principal Seymour Skinner. In the early seasons, Skinner was a specific kind of bureaucratic type. He was a Vietnam veteran whose wartime experience had left him with a complicated relationship to authority, both the authority he exercised over his students and the authority exercised over him by Superintendent Chalmers, and, most potently, by his overbearing mother Agnes. He was a man who had survived genuine extremity and had returned to find that the only world available to him was the small, limited world of an elementary school principal in a mid-sized American city. He was pathetic in the classical sense of the word, which is to say that he inspired genuine pathos. His situation was recognizable and sad in a way that the comedy did not entirely neutralize. He was also competent. This is an important detail. Early Skinner was actually a good principal in many respects. He maintained the school. He navigated the various pressures on the institution, budget shortfalls, parental complaints, Bart Simpson, with professional competence if not always personal grace. He was not a figure of mockery in the early seasons. He was a figure of gentle, respectful satire. The show understood him and treated that understanding with care. Then the show began amplifying Skinner's most comedically productive trait, his pathological relationship with his mother, at the expense of everything else. The more the writers leaned into the Agnes and Seymour dynamic, the more every other dimension of Skinner's character compressed. He became, progressively, primarily the man who was terrified of his mother. His professional competence faded. His Vietnam backstory became an increasingly comedic reference rather than a genuine component of his psychology. His relationship with Principal Chalmers, which had been a genuinely interesting power dynamic in the early seasons, became primarily a vehicle for catchphrase comedy. And then the episode The Principal and the Pauper aired in Season 9 and atomized whatever rules remained about Skinner's character. In that episode, as we have discussed before, it is revealed that the man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is an imposter named Armin Tamzarian, and the real Seymour Skinner is a Vietnam veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and returned to find his identity stolen. The revelation was intended as a creative reinvention of a character who the writers felt had become stale. Instead, it was received as a catastrophic violation of the audience's relationship with a character they had spent 9 years coming to know. The violation was not that the show gave Skinner a new backstory. The violation was that the new backstory made the previous 9 years of characterization impossible to reconcile with the character as newly revealed. If Skinner is really Tamzarian, if his relationship with his mother, his Vietnam memories, his entire psychological profile are all the product of an assumed identity, then what exactly has the audience been watching for 9 years? Who was the character in all those episodes where his specific history with Agnes was essential to the comedy and the pathos? The show's answer to this question was to have the town vote to pretend the revelation never happened. The real Skinner was expelled. Tamzarian was reinstated as Skinner. The judge declared that no one could ever speak of the true events again. And the show continued as if the episode had never occurred, with the character called Skinner behaving exactly as he had before the revelation. This is the rule-breaking at its most naked. The show broke its own rules about a character's identity and then tried to repair the break by erasing the break from the show's memory. The erasure was itself a rule violation because the rule said that consequential events stay consequential. But the erasure at least had the virtue of acknowledging that something had broken and attempting to address it, even if the addressing was itself a kind of additional breaking. The fan response to The Principal and the Pauper was sufficiently negative that it became a touchstone for discussions of the show's decline. But what is interesting, in retrospect, is that the episode's specific violation, the retroactive rewriting of a character's entire history, had been happening to all of the show's characters for years in less dramatic and more gradual ways. The Skinner episode did it suddenly and visibly. The erosion of Homer's character did it slowly and invisibly. But both were the same fundamental operation, the breaking of the rule that characters should be consistent with the histories the show had established for them. Ned Flanders underwent a less dramatic but in some ways more thorough rewriting. The early Ned was a genuinely complicated figure. He was religious in a way that was sincere and that the show took seriously as a belief system, even as it gently satirized the specific expressions of that belief. He was kind in a way that felt chosen rather than programmed. He was a man who had thought about how to live and arrived at conclusions that the show did not entirely endorse but also did not dismiss. He was a counterpoint to Homer, which was his primary structural function, but he was also a fully realized person who existed independently of his counterpoint role. Then the show began amplifying his religiosity in ways that gradually reduced it from a sincere belief system to a running joke. The specific behaviors of Ned's faith were amplified into caricature. The Ned speak, the specific linguistic patterns of his piety, became the primary vehicle for his characterization rather than one component of a complex personality. And the sincerity of his faith, the quality that made him interesting in the early seasons, was gradually replaced by a comic persona that was easier to produce jokes from but much less illuminating as a portrait of religious experience. There is a specific episode, Hurricane Nettie, from Season 8, that reveals the backstory of Ned's psychological conditioning. The revelation that Ned's niceness is the result of childhood behavioral modification rather than a freely chosen moral stance, is a genuine, creative insight. It gives his character a tragic dimension that the early seasons hinted at but never fully articulated. In this revelation, Ned is most himself, most fully realized as a person with a specific history and specific wounds. But the revelation was not followed through. Having established that Ned's kindness is pathological rather than virtuous, the show did not systematically revise its approach to his character to reflect this. The later Ned is still primarily the religious nice guy counterpart to Homer, slightly more aware of his own frustrations after the Hurricane Nettie episode, but not fundamentally changed. The revelation was absorbed and then filed away, used occasionally for specific effects, and otherwise set aside while the established comic persona continued as before. The rule that broke was the rule of revelatory consequence. When a show reveals something true and significant about a character, that revelation should change how the character is depicted subsequently. It should be incorporated into how the character sees themselves and how the show sees them. The Hurricane Nettie revelation was significant enough to justify a fundamental reassessment of Ned's place in the show's moral landscape. Instead, it was treated as an episode premise rather than a genuine turning point. Lisa Simpson's character rewriting is the most intellectually interesting case because in some respects it went in the opposite direction from the other characters. Where Homer became less complex, Lisa in certain periods became more complex, more specifically rendered, more aware of her own contradictions. But the complexity was not always consistent, and the inconsistency itself became a kind of rule violation. Early Lisa was an 8-year-old girl who was brilliant and earnest and lonely, and who expressed her loneliness primarily through her saxophone and through the specific quality of her attention to the world. She noticed things that other people missed. She cared about things that other people dismissed. She was the show's conscience, yes, but she was also specifically a child, and the childness was important. Her idealism was credible because she was 8, because the world had not yet shown her in full detail how little her idealism would matter to it. As the show continued and Lisa remained 8 years old while the world she inhabited became progressively more cynical and complicated, the show had to navigate a difficult question. What does it mean for a character with Lisa's specific sensibility to remain at the age of 8 while the world she lives in becomes demonstrably worse? The early Lisa's idealism made sense in the context of a world that was bad but not overwhelmingly so. The later Lisa's idealism exists in a world the show itself has established as structurally corrupt in ways that no amount of individual idealism can address. The show handled this by periodically allowing Lisa to be disillusioned, to see the world's failures clearly and feel their weight, and then periodically returning her to her baseline optimism without fully earning the return. The disillusionment episodes were often the show's best work with Lisa. The reset to optimism was often the show's laziest work with the same character. The rule that broke was the rule of earned emotional states. The show was not willing to commit to a Lisa who was genuinely defeated by the world's resistance to her values, because that Lisa would not be funny and would not be an effective conscience figure for the show's satirical purposes. But it was also periodically willing to show that Lisa's optimism was not warranted, that the world really was as bad as the show's own satirical portrait suggested. The two positions were irreconcilable, and the show reconciled them by alternating between them without acknowledging the alternation. The character who broke her own rules most quietly and most completely was Marge. Marge Simpson in the early seasons was a specific kind of woman. She was patient, yes, and she was devoted to her family, yes, but she was also a woman with her own ambitions and her own dissatisfactions and her own specific quality of intelligence that expressed itself differently from Lisa's book learning and differently from Homer's impulsive cleverness. She noticed emotional truth. She understood people. She read situations with an accuracy that nobody around her credited because nobody around her was paying quite enough attention to notice. She also had genuine moments of rebellion. Not dramatic rebellion, not the kind of rebellion that made headlines or changed her circumstances, but the quiet internal rebellion of a person who knows that her life could have been different, should have been different, and who has made her peace with the version she actually has, without ever quite forgetting the version that did not happen. This quality gave Marge a melancholy undertone that was one of the early show's most beautiful features. She was happy, genuinely, in the specific ways that a person who has chosen commitment over possibility can be happy. But she was also sometimes quietly not happy, and the show honored both states. In the later seasons, Marge's complexity was compressed in a different way then the other characters' complexities were compressed. She did not become more cartoonish, exactly, but she became more purely functional. Her function was to be the emotional anchor of the family, the stable center around which the chaos of Homer and Bart, and the earnestness of Lisa, and the mystery of Maggie could orbit without the whole system flying apart. This function is real and important, but in serving it, the show increasingly defined Marge by what she held together rather than by who she was independently of that holding together. Her specific intelligence faded from view. Her specific melancholy faded from view. Her specific quality of quiet rebellion faded from view. What remained was a character who was defined almost entirely by her relationship to the other characters, by what she provided to them rather than by what she experienced independently. She became, over 36 years, progressively more of a structural role and progressively less of a person, and the rule that broke was the rule that made her interesting in the first place, which was that she was both. These are the characters who changed. They are the show's most significant rule violations because they violated the most fundamental rule of all, the rule that the audience's understanding of who these people are should be stable enough to support the accumulation of 36 years of story. When the understanding breaks, when the characters become inconsistent enough that you cannot predict how they will behave or what they will care about, the accumulation becomes weightless. But there is something else we need to talk about. Something that runs beneath all of these specific character rewritings and gives them context. The economics of a fictional town. Homer Simpson earns a salary. This is one of the most foundational facts of The Simpsons. Homer works at the Springfield nuclear power plant. He is a safety inspector in Sector 7G. He is paid a wage. The wage is modest. The family lives at the economic edge that was recognizable to most of the show's original audience. The edge where things are fine as long as nothing breaks, where a major car repair or a medical bill represents a genuine crisis, where vacation is a thing that happens in theory and occasionally, expensively, in practice. The economic situation of the Simpson family was one of the original show's most carefully observed qualities. The financial anxiety was specific, and the specificity was one of the ways the show made contact with its audience. The Simpsons was not a wealthy family. They were the family that most Americans in the late 80s and early 90s recognized as their own. The family for whom money was a constant undertow, never quite drowning them but always present, always pulling. Homer's salary was part of the rules. The economic reality of the family was part of the rules. And those rules broke in ways that are so consistent and so pervasive across the show's entire run that the breaking became its own kind of rule. Homer's salary is never precisely specified in canon. Various numbers have been suggested across different episodes, and the numbers are not consistent with each other, which is itself a data point about the show's relationship with economic accuracy. But the general picture, assembled from the show's various salary references and economic situations, suggests that Homer earns somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 per year, which at various points in the show's history would represent a lower middle-class income. On this income, in Springfield, the Simpsons own their house. They own 2 cars. They take occasional vacations, sometimes international ones. They eat without apparent deprivation. Their children participate in extracurricular activities. Homer frequently purchases discretionary items, new televisions, bowling balls, elaborate food experiences that are inconsistent with the financial reality the show has established. The rule that broke, and it broke almost immediately and never really held, was the rule of economic consistency. The show established a financial reality for The Simpsons and then, from very early in its run, ignored that reality whenever the story required the family to have more money than they should have. This would be unremarkable in a show that never claimed to be realistic. But The Simpsons, as we have discussed, built its early identity on economic realism. The specificity of the family's financial situation was one of the things that made the show feel true. And the repeated violation of that specificity is one of the ways the show slowly eroded its own reality principle. The economic violations come in several varieties. The most common variety is the episode-specific windfall that funds a plot requiring money the family should not have, and that leaves no trace on the family's finances in subsequent episodes. Homer wins a prize. Homer receives an unexpected bonus. Homer discovers a cache of money. Homer is hired for a high-paying temporary position. The windfall funds the episode's adventure, and by the next episode, the family's financial situation has returned to its established baseline without any explanation of where the windfall went. This is the reset button operating on the family's finances. It is the economic version of the broader pattern we have been discussing throughout this script, the pattern of events happening without lasting consequence. The economic resets are so frequent and so thoroughly integrated into the show's structure that most viewers do not consciously register them as violations. They have become the norm. The norm is that the family has whatever money the episode requires and then returns to its established baseline. But there is a more interesting economic rule violation that cuts deeper than the episodic windfall. This is the structural impossibility of the Simpson home itself. The Simpson house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is a two-story house in what appears to be a comfortable suburban neighborhood. It has a basement and an attic. It has a reasonably large yard. It has 4 bedrooms, though the exact number has shifted depending on the episode. In the housing markets of any American city where a nuclear power plant would plausibly be located, this house, at the time the show debuted, would have required a down payment and mortgage payments that would consume a substantial portion of a lower middle-class salary. The show does not engage with this. The house exists. It has always existed. It will continue to exist. Its financial implications for the family's budget are never discussed, because discussing them would reveal an economic impossibility at the core of the show's domestic premise. As American housing costs have risen dramatically over the show's 3-decade-plus run, this impossibility has deepened. The house that was merely improbable for Homer's salary in 1989 is genuinely fantastical for any equivalent salary in 2025. The show has not acknowledged this escalating impossibility. The house remains. The finances remain vague. The economic rules that the show established in its early seasons, the rules that were supposed to ground the family in recognizable economic reality, have been quietly suspended for 36 years. And then there is the issue of Burns's economics. Charles Montgomery Burns is presented as one of the wealthiest people in America. His wealth is enormous, and the show references its enormity frequently. He has a mansion, he has extensive staff, he has political connections that allow him to treat the regulatory apparatus of the state as a personal inconvenience rather than a genuine constraint. He is the kind of wealthy that bends reality around itself. But the economics of Burns's power plant, which is the source of his wealth, are never examined with any rigor. The plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's workforce. It provides power to the entire town. It operates, as we have established, with safety violations that would bankrupt any real-world facility and criminal negligence that would, in any realistic regulatory environment, result in immediate shutdown and prosecution. The show's economic world requires that Burns be able to operate this facility without consequence, and so the show built a world in which consequence for Burns is structurally unavailable. He owns too much. He employs too many people. Too much of Springfield's economy depends on him. The rules that would normally apply, the rules of consequence and accountability, break for Burns because the show requires a specific economic arrangement that normal rules would not permit. This is a rule violation that is also, simultaneously, a genuine satirical observation. The show is breaking its own rules about how economies work specifically to illustrate how economies actually work, which is to say that they work differently for people with enormous wealth and structural power. The unrealism of Burns's immunity from consequence is a heightened, satirical version of a real unrealism in the actual world. The rule breaks, but the breaking is intentional and insightful. The economic rule violations in The Simpsons are taken together, a portrait of the way American economic life is and is not represented in popular culture. The show both engages with economic anxiety and evades it. It establishes financial hardship as a texture of the family's life, and then repeatedly delivers the family from that hardship through episodic windfalls that reset before they can accumulate into genuine improvement. It shows Burns as economically omnipotent while the people around him are economically precarious, and it treats both situations as essentially permanent and unrevisable. This is, in its strange way, exactly how the American economic system presents itself. Permanent for those at the top, resettable for those at the bottom, always generating the possibility of the windfall while ensuring that the windfall never permanently changes the underlying structure. The broken economic rules are the show's most politically resonant rule breakings. They are the places where the fictional inconsistency maps most directly onto a real-world inconsistency, where the show's inability to maintain its own economic logic mirrors an actual system's inability to maintain the economic logic it claims to operate by. Springfield's economics are broken in the same way that the American economic story is broken. The family is always almost fine. Burns is always securely fine. The gap between them is always explained as temporary, always implicitly promising resolution, and always failing to resolve. The rule that broke was the rule that economic situations should be stable enough to be meaningful. What replaced it was the rule that economic situations should be whatever the story needs them to be, which is the same rule that governs Springfield's geography and Springfield's timeline and Springfield's characters. Everything in Springfield is what the story needs it to be. The rule of consistent reality was the first and most fundamental rule. And it was the first and most fundamental rule to break. We have explored how it broke in space, in time, in character, in death, in money. Now let's look at the place where the breaking was perhaps most remarkable. The place where Springfield forgot what it had done to itself. Springfield has been destroyed. Not in the dramatic, permanent way that a city is destroyed when a war passes through it, leaving rubble that takes generations to clear and trauma that never entirely goes away. Springfield has been destroyed in the episodic way, the Springfield way, the way where the destruction is complete and total and unambiguous within the frame of a single episode and then simply does not appear in the next one. The town has burned. The town has flooded. The town has been overrun. The town has been sealed under a glass dome by the federal government. The town has lost its entire economy. The town has experienced the kinds of disasters that, in a realistic depiction of a community, would require years of recovery, would leave visible scars on the landscape and invisible scars on the people who lived through them, would change what it meant to live in that particular place forever. And then the credits roll and the next episode starts, and Springfield is fine. This is the catastrophe reset. It is the most dramatic version of the reset button rule violation that we have been discussing throughout this script. The episodic windfall that funds a plot and then disappears is a small reset. The catastrophic destruction of a community that vanishes overnight is a large one. Both are instances of the same fundamental rule violation, the violation of the rule that consequential events should have lasting consequences. But the catastrophe reset is worth examining on its own terms, because the scale of what is being reset is so much larger than the scale of what a typical sitcom reset involves that it raises questions the smaller resets do not. Let's look at a specific one. In the Season 8 episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma, Homer becomes financially desperate and takes out a loan from Marge's sisters. This is itself a reset-worthy premise. The financial desperation is resolved by the end of the episode, and the family's financial situation returns to baseline. But the episode contains, as an almost incidental detail, the information that Homer has made some disastrously bad investments that have essentially bankrupted the family. The investments are mentioned, explored for their comedic potential, and then resolved within the episode. By the time the next episode airs, the financial consequences of the bad investments have been absorbed, and the family's finances have returned to their established state of modest precariousness. The catastrophe was contained within its episode. This is the small catastrophe reset. Now let's look at a large one. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, is the most significant catastrophe the show ever deployed against its fictional world. The movie's central premise is that Homer's reckless disposal of a silo of pig waste triggers an environmental catastrophe so severe that the EPA determines Springfield must be physically sealed under a glass dome to prevent the contamination from spreading to the rest of the country. The entire town is encased. The Simpson family escapes before the dome goes up and then must return to save Springfield. The dome is in place. The dome is a federal action. The dome is a response to a genuine environmental catastrophe caused by the Simpson family's specific actions. If any event in the show's history should have permanent consequences, should be referenced in every subsequent episode as a defining moment in Springfield's history, should be a scar on the community's collective memory, it is the dome. But the movie ends with the dome being destroyed and Springfield being rebuilt, and the television episodes that followed the movie treated the dome as if it had not occurred. There are no episodes in the post-movie seasons that center on the aftermath of Springfield's doming. There are no characters whose ongoing psychology is shaped by the memory of being sealed in a contaminated zone by federal order. There are no storylines about the long-term health effects of the contamination that prompted the dome. The dome happened, and then it did not happen. The rule of lasting consequence was applied to an event of the maximum possible scale and the maximum possible consequence, and the rule did not hold. The reset button was pressed after the movie, and the show continued as if nothing had occurred. This is the catastrophe reset operating at its most remarkable scale. And the scale makes visible something about the rule violation that the smaller resets conceal. The small resets feel like convenient storytelling choices. The catastrophe resets reveal a philosophy. The philosophy is that Springfield's world does not accumulate damage. It is self-healing. Every catastrophe, from Homer's investment failures to the federal sealing of an entire community, is absorbed by the world without leaving a mark. The town's capacity for returning to normal is not a limitation, it is a superpower. Springfield cannot be permanently damaged because the show has decided that permanence is not a value this world is interested in. And this decision is, as we have noted before, related to the show's core emotional proposition. The Simpsons, as a show, is fundamentally optimistic in its structure, even when it is pessimistic in its content. The content can be dark, the satire can be biting, the commentary on American life can be genuinely depressing, but the structure is always about recovery, always about the return to the couch, the return to the house, the return to the family gathered around the television on a Sunday night. The structure says that no matter what happens, this family comes back together and the town around them comes back too. The catastrophe reset is the structural expression of this optimism. It is the show insisting, through its narrative mechanics, that catastrophe is survivable and temporary, and that normal, however weird and problematic that normal is always recoverable. This is comforting. It is the comfort that a long-running show can provide, that a realistic depiction of the world cannot. In reality, catastrophes leave marks. In reality, when a community experiences something as severe as what Springfield experiences on a regular basis, that community is permanently changed. Some communities are changed for the better, building resilience and solidarity through shared adversity. Some communities are changed for the worse, fractured by the event, and unable to recover the coherence they had before. Springfield experiences neither outcome. Springfield emerges from every catastrophe exactly as it was before the catastrophe, which means it does not build resilience and it does not fracture. It just continues, unchanged, untroubled, eternally itself. The rule violation here is the violation of reality as the show originally understood it. The early show's reality principle included the possibility of permanent change. Things that happened. The world remembered. The catastrophe reset violated this principle so thoroughly and so repeatedly that the principle itself ceased to be operative. The world forgot because the rule about the world remembering was abolished. There is a specific category of catastrophe reset that is worth its own extended examination, and that is the category of relationship damage. Because relationships in The Simpsons are catastrophically damaged and then reset with the same casual efficiency as physical disasters. Homer and Marge's marriage has been in genuine crisis more times than most real marriages survive. They have come within a conversation of separation. They have dealt with genuine betrayal, with infidelity and feeling, if not always in fact, with years of deferred resentment that finally surface in ways that should fundamentally change the relationship's architecture. And every time, the crisis resolves. The marriage recovers. Homer and Marge emerge from each crisis as devoted to each other as they were before the crisis began, with no visible scars and no apparent alteration in the dynamic that caused the crisis in the first place. In Season 4, the episode New Kid on the Block deals with Homer's attraction to a neighbor and the implications for his marriage. In Season 8, The Last Temptation of Homer explores the same territory in greater depth, with Homer forming a genuine emotional connection with a female coworker. The episode handles this with some nuance and reaches a conclusion that feels emotionally honest. Homer chooses his family. Marge remains his commitment. The temptation passes. And then the next episode, these events are over. Not processed, not integrated into the ongoing texture of the marriage, not referenced in subsequent episodes as something Homer and Marge carry with them. Simply over. The crisis happened within the episode and ended with the episode. The rule that broke was the rule that marital crises should leave the marriage different. This is how real marriages work. A couple that goes through a serious crisis comes out of it with a new understanding of the relationship, for better or worse. They know more about each other's limitations and vulnerabilities and the specific conditions under which the relationship is under pressure. That knowledge changes how they navigate the relationship going forward. Homer and Marge do not navigate their relationship differently after their crises. They navigate it exactly as they navigated it before. The crises are absorbed without leaving a trace. The marriage resets, and the marriage resets not just once but repeatedly, each time the show decides it needs a premise, and the premise is a marital crisis. This is, in a specific sense, the show's deepest dishonesty about what long-term relationships are like. The early show was honest about the specific pressures and pleasures of being in a long-term relationship in difficult economic circumstances. It understood that commitment is not the same thing as contentment, that you can deeply love someone and still find the specific reality of that love exhausting, that the same qualities that draw you to a person can also be the qualities that most frustrate you. But the early show never had to deal with the accumulated weight of 36 years of marital crises, because the early show had not yet produced 36 years of marital crises. The catastrophe reset for relationships became necessary, in a production sense, because the alternative was either to show the marriage deteriorating to a realistic endpoint or to show it growing and changing in ways that would require the show to do the difficult work of genuine character development. The reset was easier. The reset was funnier. The reset allowed the premise of the marital crisis to be deployed again in the future, because the crisis would not have permanently altered the marriage's availability for future crises. The rule broke because the show needed it to break to maintain its premise. This is the most honest answer to why any of these rules broke. The show needed to keep going. The premise of the show required specific character relationships and specific circumstances that could be maintained indefinitely. And the rules that were broken were the rules that, if followed, would have led the show somewhere that was not the established premise of the show. Rules broke because the show loved its premise more than it loved its rules. And the premise was the Simpson family on Evergreen Terrace in Springfield. Eternal, unchanged, always coming back to the couch by the end of the episode. The catastrophes were always temporary. The resets were always coming. The rules were always optional, because the rule that mattered most was not any of the specific continuity rules we have been examining tonight. The rule that mattered most was the rule that the family stays together and Springfield endures. Everything else was negotiable. Everything else was in service of that central, unbreakable rule. And that central rule is, in the end, why we are all still here, still watching, still caring about what happens in a town that forgets its own disasters, and a family that survives without changing, and a timeline that loops without end. Now let's talk about the relationships that kept contradicting themselves, because beyond the big marital crises, there is a whole architecture of secondary relationships in the show that broke their own rules in quieter and stranger ways. Every long-running show has a gravitational field of relationships that defines its world. The central relationships are the ones we know best, the ones that get the most screen time and the most narrative attention. But the peripheral relationships, the ones between secondary characters, the friendships and rivalries and professional alliances that populate the edges of the main family's life, are often where a show's specific texture lives. In The Simpsons, the peripheral relationships are a particular kind of treasure. Springfield's secondary characters are some of the most specifically realized comedy creations in television history. Mo Sislak, the melancholy bar owner with the improbable criminal history. Apu Nahasapi Mapatalan, the quick E-Mart operator whose initial function was satirical and whose complexity expanded well beyond its original satirical purpose. Chief Clancy Wiggum, the catastrophically incompetent police chief whose corruption is so total that it achieves a kind of philosophical completeness. Krusty the Clown, whose show business persona is a thin layer of paint over a portrait of professional failure and personal desolation. These characters, and the relationships they form with each other and with the Simpson family, are governed by their own set of rules. Rules about who these people are and how they relate to each other and what kind of history binds them. And those rules broke. Often gently, sometimes dramatically, always in ways that reveal something about the show's evolving relationship with its own world. The most instructive example of a peripheral relationship that broke its own rules is the relationship between Homer and his various Springfield friends. In the early seasons, Homer has a specific social life. He drinks at Moe's with Barney Gumble, a character whose specific tragedy, the collapse of a talented man into decades of alcoholism, was one of the early show's most carefully observed secondary portraits. He interacts with his neighbors, primarily Ned but also the wider neighborhood community, in ways that feel grounded in the specific rhythms of suburban social life. He has a relationship with his co-workers, Lenny and Carl, that has a texture specific to the kind of workplace friendships that form between people who spend 8 hours a day in close proximity without necessarily choosing each other for their specific qualities. The Homer-Lenny-Carl friendship is one of the show's most durable and most rule-violating relationships. In the early seasons, Lenny and Carl are Homer's friends in the way that real workplace friends are friends, which is to say that they are available, familiar, and kind to him, and he is available, familiar, and kind to them, and the friendship exists primarily in the specific context of the plant and the bar, and does not require much else to sustain itself. This is actually a very accurate depiction of a specific kind of friendship. The friendship of proximity and routine, the friendship that is comfortable and real but does not have the depth of friendships formed from genuine personal election. It is a kind of friendship that most adults who have worked in large organizations will recognize. But the show's rules about Lenny and Carl's specific identities were never entirely stable, and as the show went on, the instability became increasingly visible. Lenny and Carl's characterizations were treated as interchangeable in some episodes and as quite distinct in others. Which one of them was more intelligent, more socially aware, more emotionally grounded, varied depending on what the episode needed. In some episodes, Carl is the sensible one, and Lenny is the chaotic one. In other episodes, these qualities were allocated differently. The characters were, functionally, a single entity divided arbitrarily into two bodies, and the rule about which body carried which quality was never fully established. The relationship between Barney Gumble and the rest of the Springfield social world underwent a more dramatic rule violation. Barney in the early seasons is a figure of genuine pathos, a man who was once smart and capable, and who chose the path of least resistance to his worst impulses until the path became the only path he had. His alcoholism was depicted as genuinely destructive rather than comedically charming. The comedy around Barney was always laced with something melancholy, a recognition that there was a person in there who could have been different. Then, in Season 11, the episode Duffless follows Barney as he gets sober, and for a brief period the show explored what Barney might be like without the alcoholism. The sober Barney was more articulate, more present, more recognizably a person. The episode seemed to be opening a door into a new version of the character. The door closed. Barney returned to his established characterization in subsequent episodes. Not dramatically, not in an episode that announced his relapse, but gradually, in the way that Springfield returns everything to its established state. By the time you noticed that Barney was back to being primarily drunk in his background appearances, the sobriety storyline had been so thoroughly absorbed by the show's reset mechanism that it no longer felt like a rule violation. It just felt like something that had happened once and then stopped. But it was a rule violation. The rule that the show had established, even briefly, that Barney could be different, that his alcoholism was not the permanent terminal state of his character, was a rule about his potential. When that potential was abandoned without acknowledgement, the rule about his character changed. The abandonment said, implicitly, that Barney's alcoholism was not a tragic condition he might recover from, but rather a permanent character trait that would remain stable for the rest of the show's run, regardless of any storyline that suggested otherwise. The relationship between Homer and his boss that is perhaps the most rule-contradictory is the relationship between Homer and Mr. Burns. Burns and Homer have one of the most specific and interesting relational dynamics in the show. It is not a friendship. It is not quite a rivalry. It is something more specific, a kind of mutual instrumentalization in which Burns keeps Homer employed because Homer is too incompetent to threaten Burns's operation and too incompetent to blow the whistle on Burns's crimes, and Homer maintains his employment at a company run by a man whose values are antithetical to everything Homer cares about because the security of the job matters more than the ethics of the employer. This dynamic is genuinely rich and genuinely observed. It reflects something true about the relationship between labor and capital in the specific context of a company town, where the employer's power is total enough that the employee's choices are not really choices at all. Homer works for Burns because Homer cannot afford not to work for Burns. Burns employs Homer because Burns cannot afford a competent employee who might actually notice what the plant is doing to the town. But the rule about this relationship is that Burns cannot remember Homer's name. Burns cannot, after years of Homer working for him, retain the information of who Homer is. This is played as comedy, as a running gag, as the show's way of illustrating the incomprehensible social distance between the enormously wealthy and their employees. From Burns's position, Homer is so far below his social attention that he is simply not worth retaining. The problem is that this rule was violated repeatedly. Episodes required Burns to know who Homer was, to refer to him specifically, to treat him as a known individual rather than an anonymous employee. The exigencies of plot regularly required Burns to have a relationship with Homer that the established rule said should not exist. And rather than acknowledge the tension between the rule and the plot's requirements, the show simply did both, having Burns not know Homer in some episodes and know him very well in others, without treating the inconsistency as something that required resolution. The contradictory relationship problem in The Simpsons is ultimately rooted in the same place as all the other rule violations we have discussed. The show's characters and relationships needed to be both consistent enough to be recognizable and flexible enough to serve any premise the writers chose. These two requirements are in fundamental tension. You cannot have a relationship that is both fixed in its established rules and available for any story that needs different rules. Something has to give. In The Simpsons, what gave was the rules, and what was preserved was the flexibility. The secondary relationships that contradicted themselves most dramatically were the ones that required specific knowledge from the characters, knowledge of each other's histories, knowledge of each other's established circumstances, knowledge of events that the characters themselves had experienced and that should therefore be part of their permanent understanding of each other. The rule of shared relational history broke most clearly in the relationship between the Springfield community and the various catastrophes we discussed in the previous section. The community should remember, for example, that Homer has been responsible for multiple near catastrophes at the plant. The specific individuals who work alongside Homer, who have seen firsthand what he is capable of, should have a relationship with him that is marked by that knowledge. But they do not. Each episode largely treats the Springfield community's relationship with Homer as if no previous episode had established anything negative about him. The community is always available to be shocked or amused or frustrated by Homer's latest transgression, as if they have no history with his transgressions, as if this is the first time he has done something like this, as if their relationship with him is not accumulated over years of specific experience, but renewed, fresh, each episode. This is the relational version of the timeline reset. Just as the show resets its own history, it resets the relational knowledge that its characters have of each other. The community does not know Homer in the way that a real community knows a real person who has lived among them for decades, because knowing Homer that well would constrain what the show could do with him. The community must be available to be surprised by Homer because Homer's surprises are the engine of the comedy. There is a counterexample that proves the rule by being the exception. The character who does remember, who does have accumulated relational knowledge of Homer that is consistent and operative and shapes how she interacts with him. That character is Marge. Marge's relationship with Homer is the one relationship in the show that operates according to genuinely accumulated knowledge. Marge knows Homer. She knows his specific failure modes and his specific graces. She knows exactly how he will respond in a given situation, and her knowledge is not episodic, not resettable, not available to be replaced by surprise at Homer's behavior. She has 3 decades of specific knowledge of this man, and that knowledge shapes every interaction they have. This is actually why the marital crisis episodes work as well as they do even when their resets violate the rules. Within the crisis episode, Marge's specific accumulated knowledge of Homer, her knowledge of what he is capable of and what he is not, of where his limits are and where hers are, gives the conflict a texture that would not be available without that accumulated knowledge. The crises feel real within their episodes because the relationship feels real. And the relationship feels real because Marge has been allowed to know Homer in the full, complex way that a real partner knows a real person over 36 years. The Marge-Homer relationship is the exception that proves the rule about all the other relationships that keep contradicting themselves. Where those relationships are resettable and flexible, this one is stable and specific. Where those relationships are available for any premise, this one has the weight of genuine accumulation. Where those relationships are governed by the needs of individual episodes, this one is governed by something larger than any single episode. It is the relationship at the center of the show, the one the show has always most wanted to protect, the one whose rules have held the longest and the most consistently. Not perfectly, not without contradiction, not without the marital crisis resets that violate the principle of accumulated consequence, but more consistently than any other relationship in Springfield. And perhaps that is the final thing the show's rule-breaking teaches us, about which rules matter most to the show, about which violations it was willing to commit, and which ones it protected most carefully. The show was willing to break almost every rule it had established about almost every aspect of its world. Geography, timeline, character, death, economics, secondary relationships, catastrophic events, all of these were available for breaking when the story required it. But the rule about Homer loving Marge, the rule about that love being real and specific and not reducible to a premise or a punchline, that rule held. Imperfectly, with violations, with crises and resets. But it held in the way that the most important things hold, which is not perfectly but lastingly. The love survived the rule-breaking, survived the resets, survived 36 years of the show doing everything it could to maintain its premise at the expense of its principles. That survival is not nothing. It is, in fact, the most interesting thing about a show that broke almost all of its own rules. The most important rule held. Let's talk about the last category of rule-breaking, the most meta and in some ways the most fascinating. The moments when the show broke the wall between itself and the audience. There is a specific kind of rule-breaking in fiction that is different from all the kinds we have been discussing. When a story violates its own continuity, it breaks a rule about the world inside the story. When a character behaves inconsistently, it breaks a rule about the character inside the story. When the timeline contradicts itself, it breaks a rule about the history inside the story. All of these violations exist within the frame of the fiction. They are problems with the world being depicted, not with the act of depiction itself. But there is another kind of violation, a violation of the rules about the relationship between the fiction and the audience that experiences it, a violation that acknowledges, directly or indirectly, that the fiction is a fiction, that the characters are characters, that the world of the story is a constructed world being assembled by real people for the benefit of an audience. This is the fourth wall break, and The Simpsons used it. More frequently than most people remember, more creatively than most shows attempt, and in ways that were sometimes perfectly calibrated and sometimes deeply strange, in ways the show did not appear to fully intend. The rule that the fourth wall establishes is the rule of fictional immersion. When a story maintains its fourth wall intact, it is saying to the audience that the world within the story is real in the way that fiction is real, that the characters exist within that world and are not aware of the audience observing them, that the events of the story have the gravity of events rather than the lightness of performance. The intact fourth wall is the fiction agreeing to take itself seriously enough to ask the audience to take it seriously too. When the fourth wall breaks, all of that changes. The acknowledgement of the audience is the acknowledgement that the world is not entirely real, that the characters know they are being watched, that the story is a story and not a window. This can be deployed brilliantly, as a comic device that heightens awareness of the artifice in ways that make the fiction more interesting rather than less. Or it can be deployed clumsily, as a gag that breaks the fiction without offering anything in exchange for the broken immersion. The Simpsons deployed fourth wall breaks in both modes, and the difference between the brilliant deployments and the clumsy ones tells you a great deal about the show's evolving relationship with its own nature. In the early seasons, the fourth wall breaks were rare and deliberate. The couch gag, which opens every episode with the family running to the couch to watch television in a different variation each week, is itself a structurally meta element. It is the show acknowledging the ritual of watching television by depicting the family performing the same ritual. But it exists in the threshold space between fiction and frame, part of the show's visual grammar rather than a break in its internal logic. The first significant in-story fourth wall breaks in the early seasons were typically contained within dream sequences or fantastical set pieces, contexts where the normal rules of the show's world were already suspended and where the fiction had already signaled that it was operating in a different register. The breaks within those contexts were not rule violations because the context had already announced that different rules applied. But then something happened in the middle seasons of the show. The show began acknowledging its own status as a long-running television show within its regular narrative, not in dream sequences or special episodes, but in the main storylines of regular episodes. Characters began making references to the fact that they had been on television for a long time. Characters began acknowledging that certain things about their world were strange in ways that could only be strange if the characters had some awareness of themselves as fictional constructs. The most direct version of this is the famous moment in the season 17 episode called See Homer Run, where Homer makes reference to the fact that he has had many previous jobs and adventures. This is not quite a fourth wall break in the classical sense, but it is a character acknowledging the accumulated history of the show in a way that only makes sense if the character has some level of awareness that they exist within a long-running fictional narrative. The reference is designed to generate a knowing laugh from the audience, a laugh that requires the audience to be in on the joke about the show's own history. To generate that kind of knowing laugh, the show must invite the audience out of immersion. It must briefly pull them from the experience of watching the story to the experience of being aware that they are watching a show. And that invitation, however briefly it lasts, is the fourth wall breaking. The Simpsons invited this kind of knowing acknowledgement with increasing frequency from around season 9 onward. The show became progressively more comfortable with the idea of being a long-running television institution, and with that comfort came a progressively more casual relationship with the fiction's integrity. A long-running institution can afford to wink at itself. A young show building its world cannot afford those winks, because the winks undermine the sincerity that the world building requires. The couch gags themselves evolved in ways that illustrated this progression. Early couch gags were strange and funny and contained. They operated within the show's visual register and did not reach beyond it. They were surreal variations on a routine, not acknowledgments of the show's status as a cultural object. As the show continued, and the couch gags became one of its most celebrated features, the gags began to reach further. They began to comment on the show's own longevity. They began to incorporate references to the show's cultural status. They began, in some cases, to be produced by guest animators whose styles were explicitly not the Simpsons style, creating an experience of the show looking at itself from the outside. These evolved couch gags are often brilliant pieces of short animation. Many of them are genuinely innovative creative experiments, but they are also the most sustained fourth-wall-breaking content the show regularly produced because they are explicitly about the experience of the show rather than an experience within the show. The rule that broke was the rule of consistent register. Early Simpsons occupied one register, the register of animated family sitcom, grounded in recognizable human experience. The evolved show occupies multiple registers simultaneously, sometimes that same register, sometimes a knowing ironic distance from it, sometimes an outright meta-commentary on the show itself. The registers shift within and between episodes without the show formally announcing the shift, which means the audience must navigate the shifting registers intuitively without a clear map. Most audiences navigate this successfully. The Simpsons audience is sophisticated enough to track the register shifts, to know when the show is sincere and when it is ironic and when it is meta and when it is all three simultaneously. But the navigation requires a kind of double vision that the early show did not require, a simultaneous awareness of the fiction and the fact of the fiction that is more cognitively demanding than simple immersion. The fourth wall rule broke most dramatically in The Simpsons episodes that directly reference the show's own canonical debates, the episodes that seem to acknowledge the existence of the fan theories and fan arguments and critical analyses that have accumulated around the show's 36 years of operation. We have already discussed the episode that referenced the Homer in a coma fan theory. That reference was extraordinary in what it demonstrated about the show's self-awareness. The show knew the theory existed. The show engaged with the theory in the form of a fake deleted scene that depicted the theory's conclusion. The show then denied the theory by revealing the scene as a planted hoax. And in doing all of this, the show was simultaneously breaking the fourth wall and rebuilding it, acknowledging the fiction's external existence in the real world of fan discourse, and then retreating back into the fiction's internal logic. This operation, the break and rebuild, is one of the show's most sophisticated narrative techniques and also one of its most rule-violating, because the rule of fictional immersion cannot be both broken and maintained simultaneously. When you acknowledge the fan theories, you are acknowledging that the show is a cultural object discussed and analyzed by real people outside its fictional frame. When you then retreat into the fiction by denying the theories, you are trying to reassert the integrity of the internal world, but the acknowledgement cannot be taken back. The moment you let the audience know that you know they are there, analyzing and theorizing, the boundary between inside and outside has been crossed in a way that is not reversible. The show tried to reverse it. The show tried to use the fourth wall break as a joke, as something that could be laughed off and set aside, so that the fiction could continue as if the break had not occurred. And for most of the audience, most of the time, this worked. The show's ability to absorb its own self-consciousness into its comedic fabric is genuinely impressive. But the rule had broken. The fourth wall, once acknowledged, is permanently negotiated rather than permanently intact. Every subsequent episode that maintains the fiction does so in the knowledge that the fiction has been acknowledged from within, that the show has looked at itself through the audience's eyes and then looked away. The looking away is not the same as never having looked. There is a specific episode that illustrates this most elegantly. The season 23 episode called The Book Job, which centers on the mechanics of the book publishing industry, contains a scene where Bart explicitly stages an elaborate scheme involving the assembly of a team to write a book, with each team member serving a specific function. The scene is clearly and deliberately referencing the tropes of heist movies, and the characters' behavior within it is explicitly self-aware about the tropes they are enacting. They know they are in a genre story. They perform the genre conventions with the knowingness of people who have seen the movies this type of scene is referencing. This is a form of fourth wall breaking that does not directly address the audience, but that addresses the fiction's awareness of other fictions. The characters are not quite aware that they are in a television show, but they are aware that they are in a genre scenario, and their awareness of the genre scenario is a step in the direction of awareness of being characters in a story. It is the internal version of meta-commentary, where the fiction acknowledges its own constructed nature not by addressing the audience but by demonstrating that its characters understand how stories work. This kind of internal meta-awareness became increasingly common in the later Simpsons seasons. Characters understood genre. Characters knew how situations of their type were supposed to play out. Characters anticipated plot developments in ways that required them to have some implicit understanding that they existed within a narrative rather than simply living a life. The rule that broke was the rule of fictional sincerity. Early Springfield characters were sincere. They did not understand themselves as genre characters. They experienced their lives as lives rather than as stories. Their unawareness of genre was part of what made the satire work. The satirical effect depended on characters who genuinely believed in the world the show was satirizing, not characters who were in on the joke about what kind of world it was. When the characters began to understand genre, began to demonstrate awareness of the narrative conventions they were inhabiting, the satirical register shifted. The satire became double-layered, not just about the thing being satirized, but about the genre through which the satire was being conducted. And double-layered satire, while intellectually interesting, is less emotionally immediate than single-layered satire because the double layer requires the audience to be simultaneously inside and outside the experience, which is a position that is inherently more detached than simple immersion. The show became more ironic as it became more self-aware. And the irony, while often brilliantly deployed, also created a distance from the emotional register of the early seasons that could never quite be closed. You cannot be both fully invested in a world and fully aware that the world is a construct. The awareness inevitably creates a protective distance, and from that distance the world looks different, smaller, funnier in certain ways, less capable of breaking your heart. The breaking of the fourth wall rule is the breaking that made the show less capable of breaking your heart, and that, in the end, is the most significant rule violation of all. Not because heartbreak is the goal of a comedy, obviously it is not, but because the capacity for heartbreak, the capacity for genuine emotional investment in the fate of characters and the world they inhabit, is the thing that makes the comedy land with full weight. The jokes are funnier when the feelings underneath them are real. The satire cuts deeper when the affection for the thing being satirized is genuine. The laughter has more texture when it comes from a place of real caring about the people being laughed at and with. The early Simpsons made you care. It made you care about Homer's dignity, about Marge's longing, about Bart's terror, about Lisa's isolation. The caring was the foundation. The comedy was built on top of the caring, and the caring held the comedy up, gave it weight, made it mean something. The fourth wall breaks, the meta-awareness, the ironic distance, none of these killed the caring entirely. The show in its best moments can still make you care, can still reach through the layers of self-awareness and genre consciousness and hit you somewhere real. But the caring is harder to access now. It requires navigating through the irony to find the sincerity underneath. And navigating through irony to reach sincerity is a lot of work when you just wanted to sit down and watch your show. That is the final broken rule. The rule of unguarded sincerity. The rule that the show's affection for its characters and its world should be felt directly, without the mediation of meta-commentary or ironic distance. The rule that caring should be the default register rather than something you have to dig for. The show broke that rule gradually, over many seasons, for understandable reasons. Long-running things develop armor. Institutions develop the self-protective quality of irony because sincerity is vulnerable, and institutions cannot afford to be vulnerable. The Simpsons became an institution. Institutions arm themselves against sincerity, and the armor, while protective, also keeps out the things worth keeping in. This is where we have arrived, at the end of 36 years and 800 episodes and every broken rule along the way. We have arrived at a show that is still, in its best moments, one of the funniest and sharpest pieces of American satire ever produced. We have arrived at a show that has broken most of its own most important rules and that has survived the breaking, has continued for decades after the breaking, and has found ways to create genuine value even in the ruins of its original rule set. We have arrived, in other words, at Springfield, where the rules are broken, where the timeline doesn't work, where the geography is impossible, where the dead sometimes stay dead and sometimes do not, where the characters are sometimes who they always were and sometimes someone unrecognizable wearing a familiar name, where the catastrophes come and go without leaving marks, where the relationships contradict themselves, where the fourth wall is sometimes there and sometimes not. Springfield, where everything is broken and nothing has stopped, where the family is still on the couch, where the couch is still in the house, where the house is still on Evergreen Terrace, where Evergreen Terrace is still in Springfield, wherever Springfield happens to be this week, where Homer is still trying, where Marge is still patient, where Bart is still 10, where Lisa is still 8, where Maggie is still silent and watching and waiting. It is a quiet place, Springfield, especially late at night, when the credits have run and the television has gone dark and the broken rules have settled into a kind of familiar landscape, strange and beautiful in the particular way of things that have been going for so long that their strangeness has become a comfort. Stay here for a while. There is no need to resolve it. There is no need to make the rules whole again or demand that the contradictions explain themselves. The Simpsons has always been better at questions than answers, better at showing you the cracks than at filling them, better at letting you sit with the strangeness than at resolving the strangeness into anything clean and final. Sit with it. The timeline loops. The characters persist. The town endures. The rules are broken. The show goes on. It always goes on. That is Springfield's deepest rule, the one that never broke. Everything else is negotiable. Everything else has bent and fractured and been quietly rebuilt with whatever materials were available. But the show going on, that has been inviolable. 36 years. 800 episodes. Every broken rule in the books. And still going. We'll be here when you're ready. We always are. That's the whole point. Bart Simpson was supposed to be a revolutionary figure. Not a political revolutionary. Not the kind of revolutionary who carries signs or changes policy. A cultural revolutionary. A kid-shaped grenade lobbed at the specific kind of clean, aspirational, sanitized childhood that American television had been depicting for decades. The kind of childhood where kids had nice parents who always knew the right thing to say, where problems were small and resolvable, where the arc of any given episode bent reliably toward comfort and affirmation, and the reassurance that families were fundamentally good at their cores and that goodness was enough. Bart Simpson was not that child. He was the other child, the one who sat in the back of class and drew in his textbook, the one who made the teacher's day demonstrably worse by existing in her classroom, the one who had been told by everyone, from his father to his principal to his standardized test scores, that he was going to amount to nothing, and who had developed the specific kind of defensive recklessness that children develop when they have absorbed that message so thoroughly that the only way to live with it is to perform it on purpose, to be the thing they said you were going to be with such aggressive commitment that it looks like choice rather than inevitability. That Bart, the early Bart, was one of the great fictional children of the 20th century. Not because he was admirable, he wasn't. He was frequently awful. He caused damage that the show took seriously even when it was funny. He hurt people. He lied. He manipulated. He acted out in ways that were specifically rooted in the specific psychology of a child who had been given up on before he was old enough to understand what being given up on meant. What made him great was the texture of that psychology. The specific way his awfulness was always traceable back to something comprehensible and even sympathetic. The way the show would occasionally let you inside his terror would show you the 10-year-old underneath the bravado, and those moments of exposure were so sharp and so precisely observed that they recontextualized all of his behavior. You understood him when you saw his fear, and understanding him made the comedy and the pathos simultaneously available in a way that only very good writing can achieve. The Bart of the early seasons was governed by a specific internal logic. His pranks had a specific quality. They were not random destruction. They were targeted. They were aimed at specific people or institutions that had, in Bart's experience, failed him or condescended to him or dismissed him. Principal Skinner was a target because Skinner represented the institutional judgment that Bart was a problem to be managed rather than a child to be understood. Sideshow Bob was a target because Sideshow Bob represented the kind of adult sophistication and cruelty that Bart had never encountered in quite that form, and that activated in him a specific kind of opposition that was both terrified, exhilarated. The pranks were character. They were Bart's way of interacting with a world that had labeled him as a particular kind of failure, and the specific shape of the pranks told you everything about who Bart was and what he was responding to. Then the internal logic began to erode. The erosion started the same way it started with Homer, through amplification of the most comedically productive trait at the expense of the more complex traits underneath it. The most producible version of Bart, the version that could be deployed in any situation without requiring too much setup or psychological context, was the anarchic version. The version that just wanted to cause chaos for the joy of it, without the specific psychological grounding that made the early chaos meaningful. This version of Bart was easier to write. A Bart who causes trouble because trouble is his nature requires no setup. You do not need to explain what he is responding to, because he is not responding to anything except his own innate troublemaking energy. You just point him at a situation and let the chaos happen. The anarchic Bart is a reliable engine for comedy premises in a way that the psychologically grounded Bart is not, because the grounded Bart requires the premise to fit his specific psychology, while the anarchic Bart can fit any premise at all. The trade happened slowly. The specific fear and the specific recklessness that made the early Bart so precisely observed were traded for a more generalized anarchic energy that was funnier in certain technical ways and much less true in the deeper ways that had made the early character resonate. By season 10 or so, Bart's pranks were frequently disconnected from any identifiable psychological motivation. They happened because Bart was a character who pranked. The genre of his behavior was established. The specific content of the genre could be anything, and this is, again, the shift from character-generated plot to plot imposed on character that we identified as the foundational rule violation for Homer. The same thing happened to Bart in the same way, on a similar timeline. But there was something else happening to Bart simultaneously, something that operated alongside the comedic simplification and that was, in some respects, more interesting. The show began treating Bart's psychological situation with more sentimentality and less honesty as the seasons progressed. The early show had been honest about Bart's situation, which is to say that it had been honest about how hard it was, about how limited his options were, about how the specific failures of his education and his emotional context had put him on a trajectory that was difficult to alter. The later show began moving in the direction of sentimentality, of episodes that ended with Bart having learned a lesson, having connected with someone in a way that suggested the possibility of growth, having demonstrated a quality of character that the episode insisted was always there underneath the surface. These sentimental episodes were not without value. Many of them were quite moving, but they operated according to a different emotional logic than the early episodes, a logic in which Bart's specific situation was ultimately redeemable, in which the lessons were available and the growth was possible, in which the character could be shown as fundamentally good-hearted in ways that the early show had been careful to keep more ambiguous. The rule that broke was the rule of honest complexity. Early Bart was complex in the specific sense that he was both bad and good, and neither state was fully stable and neither was being sentimentally privileged over the other. Later, Bart was complex in the sense that he had both anarchic and sentimental modes that the show could deploy depending on what the episode needed. But the complexity was additive rather than integrated. It was not the complexity of a coherent psychology, but the complexity of a character who served multiple functions and could be rotated between them as needed. There is one specific moment in the show's treatment of Bart that crystallizes the rule violation most precisely. It is not a single episode, but a relationship, the relationship between Bart and Lisa. In the early seasons, the Bart-Lisa dynamic is one of the show's most carefully realized relationships. They are siblings who are genuinely different from each other in every dimension that matters. Different in their intelligence, different in their emotional processing, different in their social positions, different in their relationships to the world around them. And the difference creates a specific kind of tension that is also a specific kind of affection. The tension of people who are close enough to see each other clearly and different enough that what they see is often frustrating. They fight, they undermine each other. They are casually cruel to each other in the ways that siblings who live at close range in a small house are casually cruel. And they are also in specific moments that the show earned carefully and deployed sparingly, genuinely loving. The love is real precisely because the show did not perform it constantly. It was revealed through the tension, visible in the moments when the tension lifted enough that you could see what was underneath. The later seasons handled the Bart-Lisa relationship with progressively more sentimentality and progressively less of the tension that made the sentimentality meaningful. The episodes that centered on their relationship tended to move fairly quickly from conflict to affirmation, from difference to the recognition of underlying connection. The recognition was often warmly observed, but the movement toward it was too fast, too reliable, too sentimentally predetermined to feel genuinely earned. The rule that broke was the rule of earned emotional resolution. Early Bart and Lisa episodes earned their emotional moments through the specific work of depicting the tension between these two specific children. Later episodes claimed the emotional moments more cheaply, treating the affirmation as a premise given rather than something that had to be worked toward from an honest starting point. This pattern extends to Bart's other significant relationships. His relationship with Homer underwent a similar sentimentalization. The early Homer-Bart dynamic was genuinely difficult. Homer strangled Bart, which in real life is abuse and which the show was periodically honest enough to acknowledge the darkness of, even while containing it within the frame of cartoon comedy. The strangling was a physical expression of Homer's failure to find adequate language for his frustration, and the show understood this in its early seasons, kept the comedy of the strangling in tension with the troubling reality of what the strangling represented. In the later seasons, the Homer-Bart relationship was sentimentalized in the same way everything else was sentimentalized. Episodes that explored the father-son dynamic tended toward affirmation of the underlying love rather than honest examination of the damage that the dysfunctional expression of that love was causing. The strangling became a running gag entirely, stripped of whatever complexity it had once carried. And the tenderness between Homer and Bart became more explicit and more freely given, which was emotionally satisfying in the moment but less honest than the early show's insistence that the tenderness had to be earned from underneath the dysfunction. Bart Simpson was the show's original revolutionary. By the middle seasons, he had been reformed into a more conventional sitcom mischief maker, reliable for specific types of comedy, deployable in a wide range of premises, sentimentalized in his emotional moments, and largely disconnected from the specific psychological truth that had made him genuinely revolutionary in the first place. The rule that broke was the rule of Bart's specific truth. The rule that said this particular child's situation was particular and not generic, that his recklessness came from somewhere, and pointed somewhere, and was not just a character trait to be deployed for comedy, but a portrait of something real about how certain children survive difficult circumstances. That portrait faded. What remained was the outline, recognizable and comfortable and available for any premise, but missing the specific weight of what was behind the lines. Every great fictional universe has its secondary spaces, the places that orbit the central narrative and provide it with texture and contrast, and a sense of the wider world that exists beyond the main family's daily experience. In The Simpsons, these secondary spaces are numerous and each has its own internal logic, its own rules about what it is and what happens there. Moe's Tavern is the most important of these secondary spaces. It is the place where Homer goes when the main narrative requires him to be somewhere other than home, and it has accumulated, over 36 years, its own substantial history and its own set of rules about what kind of place it is. The rules about Moe's were established early and were specific. Moe Sislak was a bartender of indeterminate criminal history, suggested Eastern European origin, and a face that had been, in various canonical descriptions, described in terms that were consistently extreme and uniformly unflattering. The extreme plainness of Moe's appearance was one of his defining characteristics, referenced constantly by the other characters and by Moe himself with a mixture of resignation and dark self-awareness. Moe knew what he was. He was not a man who harbored illusions about his position in the social order of Springfield. He was the person who poured drinks for the people who were trying to briefly forget their position in the social order, which put him at least one rung below everyone he served. The tavern he ran was a specific kind of bar, not the glossy, aspirational bar of television fantasy, where the wood is warm, and the light is flattering, and the regulars are charming, and the whole thing glows with the promise of belonging. Moe's Tavern was the other kind of bar, the kind that exists in the specific economic and social circumstances of a town where a significant portion of the male population needs somewhere to go that is not home. It was unambiguously a dive. The floor was of questionable cleanliness. The health violations were implied and occasionally explicit. The clientele were men who were not, for various reasons and to various degrees, managing very well, and who were using the specific social anesthesia of the bar to continue not managing intolerable company. This was the rule of Moe's. It was a place of managed despair. The despair was real, but the management of it was also real, and the management included humor and companionship and the specific dignity of people being honest with each other about how little was going their way. It was not a happy place. It was a sustaining place, which is different, and the difference is important. The early Simpsons understood the difference and depicted it with care. The humor that emerged from Moe's came from a place of genuine understanding of what the bar was and what it meant to the people who used it. The jokes about the bar's grimness were not contemptuous. They were the jokes of people who lived inside the grimness and had developed the capacity to find it funny, which is one of the most human things people do. Then the rules about Moe's began to shift. The first significant shift was in the show's treatment of Moe himself. In the early seasons, Moe's despondency was genuine. He was a man who had not turned out the way he had expected, and who was not entirely at peace with the gap between expectation and reality. His cruelty, which was a real component of his characterization in the early seasons, was the cruelty of someone who was in pain and did not always manage that pain gracefully. He lashed out. He was petty. He was sometimes genuinely unpleasant. But the show understood why he was unpleasant, and did not invite the audience to dismiss him as simply a bad person. He was a wounded person, and his wounds were visible. As the seasons progressed, Moe's character was amplified in two different directions simultaneously, neither of which was fully compatible with the original characterization, and neither of which was compatible with the other. In one direction, Moe was amplified toward broad comedy. His self-pity was exaggerated into a running gag. His cruelty was heightened into a kind of cartoonish villainy that was easier to laugh at because it was more detached from any comprehensible psychology. The Moe of the middle seasons was frequently a punchline rather than a character. His darkness was performed rather than felt. In the other direction, Moe was periodically the subject of episodes that pulled him toward genuine pathos, that explored his loneliness and his longing for connection and his specific failures with specific emotional seriousness. These episodes were often very good. They worked because the early characterization had established enough of Moe's genuine psychology that the show could return to it when it needed to and find it still functional, still capable of generating real feeling. But the two amplifications were incompatible. The broadly comedic Moe, the one who was a punchline, required the audience to maintain a protective distance from the character. The pathetic Moe, the one who was genuinely lonely, required the audience to close that distance and feel his situation with empathy. The show moved between these two registers frequently and without signaling the transition clearly, which meant that the audience was never quite sure which register was operating, and therefore could not fully commit to either. This is the rule that broke with Moe, the rule of consistent register. A character can be both funny and pathetic, can be a source of comedy and a source of genuine feeling. But this requires that the two registers be integrated rather than alternated. In the early Simpsons, Moe's comedy and his pathos were integrated. The funny things about him were funny because of the same things that made him sad. The laughter came from the same place as the feeling, and this integration was what gave the early characterization its depth. In the later Simpsons, the comedy and the pathos were separated. They existed in different episodes, deployed for different purposes, calibrated for different audience responses. The integration was lost, and with it, the specific quality of Moe's early characterization, the quality that made him one of the show's most honestly drawn secondary characters, was replaced by a more modular version of the same character that could serve any of the show's tonal needs without being quite true to any of them. The bar itself underwent a related transformation. In the early seasons, Moe's Tavern had a specific and consistent character as a space. You knew what kind of place it was the moment you saw it. The darkness, the smoke, the specific quality of the clientele, all of these communicated the bar's nature economically and accurately. It was a place with specific rules about who came there and why and what they were looking for. In the later seasons, the bar became more of a general-purpose gathering space. It was the place where things happened, rather than the place that was itself a thing. Its specific character was subordinated to its function as a location, a backdrop against which the show could set scenes that needed to be set somewhere outside the Simpson home. The bar's specific rules, the rules about what kind of place it was and what that meant for the people in it, were replaced by the generic rule of a sitcom gathering space, available for any scene that needed a public interior location. This happens to secondary spaces in long-running shows with a consistency that almost functions as a law. The space that begins as a fully realized place with its own internal logic becomes, over time, a location that serves the narrative's needs without asserting its own identity. The school becomes wherever school scenes happen. The church becomes wherever church scenes happen. The bar becomes wherever bar scenes happen. The specific texture of each space, the quality that made each one a distinct place rather than a generic backdrop, erodes as the show's need for flexibility in its locations comes to override its commitment to spatial specificity. This is, again, the geography rule-breaking, but at a smaller and more intimate scale. Not the question of where Springfield sits in the American landscape, but the question of what each of Springfield's locations actually feels like from inside, and what rules govern the experience of being in each one. The loss of Moe's Tavern as a specific place with specific rules is mourned by long-term viewers in a way that is somewhat difficult to articulate but unmistakably felt. The bar in the early seasons was a place you could almost smell. You understood its specific quality so thoroughly that it could function as a character in its own right, as a space with a personality that was part of the show's emotional texture. The bar in the later seasons is a set, a functional, recognizable, efficiently deployed set, but a set rather than a place. And the difference between a set and a place is the difference between depicting something and understanding it, between showing you a bar and putting you inside one. The rules of Moe's Tavern that broke were the rules of understanding rather than depiction. They were the rules that required the show to know what kind of place it was depicting and why that mattered, and what the people inside it were really doing there. When those rules broke, the tavern lost its soul. Not its identity, it remains recognizably Moe's, but its soul. The quality of genuine specific knowledge that had inhabited the space in the early seasons and that cannot be replaced by any amount of visual consistency or character continuity. Every October, The Simpsons produces an episode called Treehouse of Horror. The episode has been produced since the show's second season. It consists of 3 or 4 short horror comedy segments set in an alternate universe where the show's normal rules do not apply. Characters die, monsters exist, the supernatural is real. Events occur that could not occur in the show's regular fictional reality. And at the end of the episode, the credits roll and the next regular episode airs as if none of it happened. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are beloved. They are often cited among the show's greatest creative achievements. They have produced some of the most iconic and most quoted moments in the show's history. The Shining parody, the Homer becoming a 3-dimensional object sequence, the various alien invasion scenarios, the reanimation of dead pets. These are canonical moments of animated television at its most inventive and most free. They are also a fascinating case study in intentional rule-breaking that was so clearly marked and so consistently contained that it never violated the regular show's rules in any meaningful sense. The Treehouse episodes were their own category. They operated by their own rules. And the audience's understanding that these were alternate universe stories, that anything that happened within them did not carry over into the regular show's canon, was so thoroughly established from the beginning that the rule violations within the Treehouse episodes did not feel like violations at all. They felt like license. The fun of those episodes was precisely the freedom from the regular rules. But this established structure, the treehouse as a zone of intentional rule-breaking, had an interesting side effect on the regular show's relationship with its own rules. Because the treehouse episodes demonstrated, annually, that the show knew how to break its rules deliberately and contain the breakage within a clearly marked frame, the regular show's rule-breaking felt different by comparison. When the regular show violated its own continuity or character rules without the frame of deliberate experimentation that the treehouse episodes provided, it was not exercising the same kind of creative freedom. It was doing something messier and less intentional. The treehouse episodes were rule-breaking with awareness and craft. The regular show's rule violations were rule-breaking with inconsistency and convenience. And the contrast between the two modes made the regular show's violations more visible, more noticeable, and in retrospect, more troubling. Think about it this way. If a friend tells you they are going to lie to you right now, as a game, and then lies to you, the lie is not a breach of trust, because the frame was clearly established. But if that same friend lies to you without establishing the frame, the lie is a very different matter. The intentionality of the deception changes what the deception means. The treehouse episodes were the show telling you, clearly and annually, that it knew how to break its rules on purpose within a controlled context. The regular show's rule-breaking was the show doing it without telling you, without establishing the frame, without giving you the information you needed to understand what kind of rule-breaking you were witnessing. This made the regular violations harder to absorb. Not impossible, the audience was generally sophisticated enough to accept the regular show's inconsistencies as the cost of doing business with a long-running animated series. But harder. More likely to nag at you on rewatch. More likely to produce the specific frustration of feeling that something you cared about had been handled carelessly. The treehouse episodes also established, by contrast, something important about what the regular show could do when it was working at its best. The freedom of the treehouse context. The freedom to do anything, to take any premise, to follow any creative impulse, produced some of the show's most inventive work. The constraints of the regular show, the constraints that were both enabling and limiting, produced different work that was sometimes better and sometimes less adventurous. The show that broke its rules without quite knowing it was breaking them was not the same show as the one that broke its rules on purpose within a carefully established frame. And the existence of the treehouse tradition made this comparison available in a way it would not have been without it. Every year, the deliberate version of rule-breaking aired. Every week, the inadvertent version continued. The contrast between them was one of the most revealing things about the show's evolving relationship with its own creative principles. There is a specific treehouse rule violation that is worth examining in detail because it actually spilled out of the treehouse context and into the regular show in a way that was acknowledged by neither the show nor its audience at the time, and that reveals something significant about how the boundary between the treehouse universe and the regular universe was maintained. In Treehouse of Horror 5, which aired in October of 1994, the first segment, called The Shinning, depicts Homer as the caretaker of a remote resort that begins to drive him mad, and the segment ends with Homer having been frozen into a topiary by Marge and Bart, a fate that is clearly terminal in the regular show's logic, if not in the Treehouse's alternate universe logic. Immediately after the credits of that Halloween episode, in what appears to be a continuous broadcast moment, the show produces a brief tag scene in which the frozen Homer is seen still alive, still present, having survived the Treehouse events in some form. This brief continuation blurs the line between the Treehouse universe and the regular show's universe. The boundary is not quite maintained. The Treehouse event appears to be acknowledged by a scene that occurs in what looks like the regular show's space. This is a small and probably mostly unintentional blur, but it illustrates the fundamental challenge of maintaining the Treehouse frame over 30-plus years of production. The frame requires consistent vigilance. It requires that every creative choice within the Treehouse episodes be clearly marked as Treehouse universe choices, rather than regular universe choices. And, over 30 years of annual production, the marking occasionally slips. The frames occasionally blur. The line between deliberate rule-breaking and inadvertent rule-breaking occasionally becomes less clear than the concept requires it to be. The Treehouse of Horror is a beautiful creative institution and one of the show's most consistently excellent annual achievements. But it is also a living illustration of the difficulty of maintaining any rule about what kind of story a long-running show is permitted to tell. Rules require vigilance to maintain, and vigilance is hard to sustain over 36 years of weekly production at the rate that The Simpsons has maintained. The Treehouse's deliberate rule-breaking and the regular show's inadvertent rule-breaking are, in the end, two expressions of the same creative reality. Rules are hard to maintain. The longer a show runs, the harder they become to maintain. And the show that began with the clearest creative rules in the history of animated television has spent 36 years discovering, in various ways and at various scales, what happens when those rules prove impossible to fully sustain. What happens is Springfield. And Springfield, for all its broken rules, remains. It always remains. There is a kind of community memory that operates in small towns in America, a memory that is not quite the same as institutional record-keeping and not quite the same as individual recollection, but is something between the two, a shared knowledge held lightly by everyone and firmly by no one, available to be accessed and also available to be revised. Springfield has a version of this community memory. It has the specific quality of a town that knows its own history without being entirely bound by it. The history is there. It exists in the form of established facts, things that happened and that are acknowledged as having happened, but the history is also surprisingly flexible, surprisingly available for revision when the revision serves a community purpose. This is not unique to Springfield. Real small towns operate this way. Communities edit their own histories constantly, emphasizing what is useful and minimizing what is uncomfortable, and occasionally outright denying what is too painful or too complicated to carry. The community memory is always a political act as much as a historical one. What is unique to Springfield, or at least what is uniquely prominent in the show's depiction of Springfield's memory, is the speed and completeness with which the community is able to forget consequential events. The forgetting happens not gradually, over years of erosion, but essentially immediately, within an episode. Between episodes with no elapsed time implied, catastrophes occur and the community memory simply does not retain them. We have discussed this in the context of physical catastrophes, the dome, the disasters, the events of geological scale that leave no mark on the community's subsequent life. But the community's memory failure extends beyond physical catastrophe to include a much broader range of events that should, by any reasonable measure, be part of the community's ongoing sense of itself. The most interesting category of this extended forgetting is the category of moral and social knowledge. The things that Springfield knows about itself and its residents that should shape how the community functions, but that are repeatedly forgotten when remembering them, would be inconvenient. Springfield knows, or has at various points known, that its mayor is corrupt. Not vaguely corrupt, specifically and demonstrably corrupt. Mayor Quimby has been depicted in various episodes engaging in bribery, electoral fraud, misuse of public funds, romantic relationships with women who are not his wife while maintaining the fiction of a happy marriage, and various other acts of municipal dishonesty that in any realistic political environment would end a career definitively. The show returns to Quimby's corruption as a recurring premise, which means the community is repeatedly reminded of what its mayor is and what its mayor does. And the community continues to re-elect him, episode after episode, year after year. The corruption is known. The corruption is repeated. The corruption is, within the show's fictional frame, not even denied, it is openly practiced. And the community forgets it between elections with the same efficiency that it forgets everything else that should permanently alter its self-understanding. This is both a satirical point and a rule violation. The satirical point, that communities often tolerate and even celebrate political corruption in figures who provide entertainment or economic security or simply the comfort of continuity, is valid and accurately observed. It is one of the show's more pointed satirical observations about American civic life. But it is also a rule violation in the specific sense that the show established, in its early seasons, that its characters did have meaningful civic memories, that they did track certain things about the community over time, that their political opinions were consistent with their established interests and concerns. The rules about Springfield as a community included the rule that the community learned from its experiences, at least to some degree. The later show violated this rule consistently in the service of both its satirical agenda and its narrative needs. A Springfield that remembered and acted on what it knew about Mayor Quimby's corruption would be a Springfield where political storylines had consequences that constrained future political storylines. A Springfield that forgot between elections was a Springfield where any political premise could be deployed without reference to the established political history of the community. The community's forgetting was, in other words, the same kind of creative convenience that governed all of the show's other rule violations. It made the show more flexible. It made more premises available. It made the world more accommodating to whatever the current episode needed to do. And the cost was the same cost that all the other flexibility extracted. The cost of the world feeling less real, less specific, less like a community with genuine depth, and more like a painted backdrop available for any scene. There is something genuinely important to sit with here. Something about what the show was doing intentionally and what it was doing inadvertently when it depicted a community with comprehensive memory failure. The intentional element was the satire. The show was making a point about American communities and their capacity for collective self-deception. The repeated depiction of Springfield forgetting its own catastrophes, its own corruption, its own residents' crimes against the community good, was a satirical portrait of the way real American communities handle inconvenient knowledge. The satire was pointed. It was accurate. It was one of the things the show did best during its entire run. The inadvertent element was what the satire cost the show's narrative coherence. The satirical portrait of community memory failure required the show to actually depict that memory failure in its own narrative mechanics. The show could not show Springfield forgetting without the show itself forgetting, without the show's own narrative continuity being governed by the same reset logic that governed Springfield's community memory. The satire and the rule violation were the same act. The observation and the operational failure were one and the same. This is the deepest and most philosophically interesting thing about The Simpsons' relationship with its own rules. The rule violations were often not separate from the show's creative intentions. They were embedded in the creative intentions. The show was doing something with the violations, using them for satirical or emotional or narrative purposes. The violations were not accidental. They were structural. They were part of the show's way of depicting its world. Which means the question of whether the show broke its rules is more complicated than it first appears. In one sense, yes. The rules were clearly established and clearly violated. In another sense, the violations were themselves part of the show's project. They were the show depicting a world that operates without the kind of consequential continuity that rules require. A world where memory fails and catastrophes are forgotten, and characters shift and geography moves and time loops. That kind of world requires rule violations to depict accurately. You cannot show a world without consequences by maintaining the rule that all actions have consequences. The show broke its rules because the rules were incommensurate with the world the show was trying to show you. And the world the show was trying to show you, Springfield in all its broken, looping, forgetting, rule-violating absurdity, is recognizable. Horrifyingly, comfortingly recognizable. Because Springfield is America, drawn in bright colors and cartoon proportions, but recognizably, inarguably America. A place where the catastrophes are forgotten, and the corruption continues, and the billboard says one thing, and the reality says another, and everyone drives past it every day, without quite registering the contradiction. The rules of The Simpsons broke because Springfield's rules break. Because the world Springfield depicts breaks its own rules constantly and comprehensively. And a show depicting that world with any honesty had to eventually become a world that broke its own rules too. That is the final answer to the question we have been circling all night. Why did the rules break? Because the thing being depicted does not obey rules. Because America, Springfield's original, does not maintain its own narrative consistency. Because real communities forget. Because real timelines contradict. Because real characters change in ways that are not always coherent with who they were. Because real economies violate their own logic. Because real deaths are sometimes permanent and sometimes absorbed into the ongoing story without leaving the mark you expected. The Simpsons broke its rules because its world broke first. And the brokenness was not an accident or a failure. It was the show telling the truth in the only way it could. With the tools available to it, with the constraints it had inherited, with the audience it had built, with the history it had accumulated, the truth came out in the shape of the violations. In the reset buttons and the catastrophe erasures and the character inconsistencies and the timeline contradictions and the geographic impossibilities and the fourth wall winks and the community forgetting, all of it, every broken rule, was the show trying to be honest about a world that does not hold together perfectly. that runs on a kind of collective fiction maintained by people who need the fiction to be true more than they need it to be accurate. Springfield is us. The broken rules are ours. And every time we press play, every time we start another episode, we are choosing, the way Springfield chooses, to maintain the fiction, to let the reset happen, to allow the world to be what we need it to be rather than what it demonstrably is. That is the bargain. That has always been the bargain, and we have been keeping it, quietly and willingly and with full knowledge, for 36 years. The rules broke. The show went on. We stayed. That is the story. There is a sound in The Simpsons that carries more emotional weight than any other sound in the show's 36 years of production. It is not Homer's catchphrase, though that is iconic. It is not the theme music, though that is beloved. It is not even the couch gag's specific rhythm of family members running and landing, though that rhythm is one of the most conditioned responses in American television history. It is Lisa Simpson playing her saxophone. The saxophone is Lisa's, not in the possessive sense of ownership, though she does own it, but in the deeper sense that the instrument is an extension of her inner life in a way that nothing else in Springfield is for any other character. When Lisa plays, she is expressing something that the show does not have another language for. The words she uses, brilliant, passionate, articulate, are insufficient. The facial expressions the show gives her, earnest, intense, sometimes devastated, are insufficient. The saxophone is the sufficient language. It is the language that says what she cannot otherwise say, which is that she is here, that she is present, that she is feeling something immense that Springfield does not have room for. The rules about Lisa's saxophone were established early and were specific. Lisa played jazz. Specifically, she played in the tradition of jazz as a language of interiority, as a means of expressing emotional complexity through musical form rather than verbal articulation. This was not accidental. Jazz, particularly the improvisational tradition that Lisa's playing most resembles, is a form built on the premise that feeling can be communicated more precisely through sound than through language. It is a form that emerged from communities experiencing things that language, especially the dominant language of the culture around them, was inadequate to express. Lisa's connection to jazz was therefore a connection to a tradition of using music to say the things that the world around you will not let you say in any other form. The show understood this in the early seasons and depicted it with care. When Lisa played in the early episodes, the playing served a specific narrative function. It was the show finding a way to let the audience inside Lisa's emotional experience without having her articulate that experience in words. The words would have been too easy. The saxophone was the honest language. The rules about what the saxophone represented, what kind of emotional work it was doing in the show's narrative, were maintained reasonably well through the middle seasons. There were specific episodes like Round Springfield and Lisa's saxophone itself, that took the instrument and what it meant to her with genuine seriousness and produced work of considerable beauty. But the saxophone, like everything in the later show, was also available for comedic deployment. It became in certain episodes primarily a prop that established Lisa's musical identity without necessarily being used to do the specific emotional work that the early saxophone scenes were designed to do. The instrument appeared. Lisa played. The playing established the familiar visual grammar of Lisa as musician, and then the scene moved on, without the playing having served the deeper purpose of genuine emotional expression. This is a subtle erosion, subtler than the other rule violations we have examined, but it represents the same fundamental pattern. The specific function of a storytelling element was replaced by the general function of the same element as an identifier. Lisa plays saxophone. The saxophone identifies Lisa as the thoughtful musical child. The identification happens and the scene continues. The original, more demanding function of actually communicating emotional depth through the image of Lisa playing was gradually subordinated to this simpler identifying function. The rule that broke was the rule of purpose. Every storytelling element should serve a specific purpose. When elements become generic identifiers rather than specific tools, they lose the precision that made them effective in the first place. The saxophone remained. Its meaning, the deep and specific meaning of what it represented about Lisa and what it communicated about her inner life, faded from the prominent place it had occupied in the early show's emotional vocabulary. There is a reason we are ending this section with Lisa and her saxophone. Not just because the saxophone is one of the show's most beautiful recurring images, but because Lisa herself represents something about the show's entire relationship with its own rules that the other characters do not. Lisa is the character who follows the rules most faithfully. She is principled. She maintains her values even when the world around her ignores them. She insists on consistency when every incentive is to accept the inconsistency and move on. She is, within the show's own fictional world, the character most committed to the rules that Springfield keeps breaking. And the show keeps breaking its rules about Lisa. It breaks the rule that her intelligence should have consequences. It breaks the rule that her values should shape the world around her. It breaks the rule that her loneliness should be acknowledged and addressed rather than reset at the start of each episode. It breaks the rules about who she is and what she is capable of in exactly the same ways it breaks the rules about everything else. And Lisa keeps playing. She keeps picking up the saxophone and saying the things that cannot be said in words in a town that will not listen, in a show that has spent 36 years breaking the rules that should have made her situation matter more than it does. That is the most honest thing The Simpsons has ever done. Not the satire, which is brilliant. Not the character comedy, which is often transcendent. The most honest thing is Lisa Simpson, still 8 years old, still playing jazz in a world that does not fully understand what she is expressing, still insisting on the rules that everyone around her keeps breaking. Still here, still playing, still meaning something that resists the reset. That is the rule that held inside all the rules that broke. The meaning, the specific, resistant, insistent meaning that some things in Springfield are trying to express, held. Even when the expression was imperfect. Even when the rules around it collapsed. Even when the show forgot what it was supposed to be and then remembered and then forgot again. The meaning was there, it is still there. That is why we are here tonight, sitting with Springfield in the quiet hours, going back through the broken rules and finding, inside the breaks, the things that held. Lisa's saxophone is still playing. Somewhere in Springfield, in the permanent present of the floating timeline, in the geographical impossibility of a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, in the coma dream or the radiation field or the collective fiction or whatever Springfield actually is underneath its impossible surface, the saxophone is still playing. And whatever else the show broke, whatever rules fell away over 36 years of production, it never broke the meaning of that sound. The rules are broken, the music continues, and that, in the end, is enough. More than enough. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is what we come back to, night after night, episode after episode, couch gag after couch gag, not the continuity, which is ragged, not the timeline, which is impossible, not the geography, which is everywhere and nowhere, not the characters, who have shifted and contradicted and been rewritten and restored and broken and repaired. We come back for the music, for the thing that holds inside the thing that breaks, for the specific, insistent, indestructible meaning that Lisa Simpson has been trying to express for 36 years in the one language that Springfield cannot quite refuse. The saxophone. Still playing? In the beginning, the guest stars were a statement. Michael Jackson called and wanted to appear on The Simpsons. Not play himself, but provide the voice for a large, white, gentle man in a mental institution who believed he was Michael Jackson. The appearance was secret at the time of broadcast. The credit read as John J. Smith. The mystery was part of the pleasure. And the episode, titled Stark Raving Dad, was extraordinary not because Michael Jackson was in it, but because the episode knew exactly what to do with Michael Jackson being in it, which was to use the appearance to tell a genuinely moving story about a father trying to do right by his daughter, and a daughter who wanted something from her father that he did not know how to give. The guest star was a tool in the story's service. He was not the story. He was not the premise. He was the means by which the story achieved its specific emotional effect, and the effect was proportionate to the guest star's specific qualities, specifically the emotional weight that the Jackson persona carried, and the ironic tension between that weight and the character's situation in the episode. This was the original rule about guest stars. Guest stars were tools. They were deployed in service of specific stories that needed specifically what those guests could provide. Their appearances were rare enough that each one felt like a creative event. And the creative event had a specific purpose. The rule was clear. The rule was also, as with all the other rules, temporary. As the show's cultural status grew and its reputation for interesting guest appearances became one of its marketing assets, the guest star economy shifted. The appearances became more frequent. The purposes became more varied. The rule about guests serving the story began competing with a different rule, the rule that famous people are interesting to watch regardless of the context in which they appear, and that their presence in an episode is inherently valuable as entertainment. The second rule is not wrong. Famous people are interesting to watch. Their appearances in The Simpsons were often entertaining independent of whether they served the story's specific needs. But the second rule is also a weaker rule than the first one. It produces weaker episodes. Episodes that are interesting because a famous person is in them are less interesting than episodes that are interesting because the famous person's specific qualities were used to illuminate something true about the story being told. The guest star frequency escalated through the middle seasons in ways that the show's own storytelling capacity could not always support. By the later seasons, the show was averaging multiple guest stars per season, sometimes multiple guest stars per episode, and the purposes of the appearances ranged from deeply considered to purely decorative. The purely decorative appearances were, in their way, a kind of rule violation. Not because there is anything inherently wrong with a famous person appearing in a cartoon to do a funny thing and leave, but because the established rule of The Simpsons guest appearance said that appearances served specific stories, and when the appearances stopped serving specific stories and started simply being appearances, the rule had broken. The most significant effect of this escalation was not on any individual episode but on the show's relationship with its own world. Springfield, as a fictional space, had a specific relationship to the real world in the early seasons. Famous people existed in the show's universe but occupied a specific position. They were the external world from which Springfield was distinguished. Their occasional appearance was a moment where the outside world briefly entered Springfield's hermetically sealed reality, and the contrast between their world and Springfield's was part of what made the appearance interesting. As guest appearances became more frequent, the distinction between Springfield's internal world and the external celebrity world began to dissolve. Springfield started feeling less like a sealed fictional universe and more like a place that shared a continuous reality with the actual world of contemporary American celebrity culture. And this shift, this opening of Springfield's world to the constant traffic of real-world figures, changed the show's gravitational field in ways that weakened its internal coherence. The rule that broke was the rule of Springfield's sovereignty. Early Springfield was its own country. It had its own people, its own institutions, its own logic. The real world could visit, briefly, for specific purposes, but the sovereignty of the fictional space was maintained. The visits were diplomatic missions from outside, governed by the rules of Springfield rather than by the rules of wherever the visitors came from. Later Springfield was less sovereign. The celebrity traffic had made it more porous. The boundary between inside and outside had become negotiable, and the negotiability of that boundary was one of the factors that made the later show feel less hermetically real than the early show, less like a place with its own inexorable internal logic, and more like a production vehicle for funny things that famous people could do. The guest star rule is a smaller rule than the timeline rule or the character rule. Its breaking was less consequential than those more fundamental violations. But it is revealing about the show's evolving relationship with its own creative priorities. The early show was willing to sacrifice quantity for quality, to deploy famous people sparingly for specific creative purposes. The later show was less willing to make that sacrifice, or perhaps more accurately, less able to resist the pressures that pushed toward more frequent and more decorative appearances. This inability to resist pressure is itself characteristic of long-running institutions. The pressures that push a long-running show away from its original creative principles are real and varied. Commercial pressures, audience expectation, the accumulated weight of precedent, the difficulty of maintaining the same creative standards over hundreds of episodes and decades of production. All of these pressures push toward the accommodations that break the rules. The Simpsons accommodated. It accommodated on the guest stars, and on the timeline, and on the characters, and on the geography, and on the deaths, and on all the other rules we have been examining. It accommodated because the alternative, which was to maintain all its original rules perfectly over 36 years, was not really an alternative at all. It was an impossibility. No creative enterprise of that duration and that scale maintains its original rules without accommodation. The question was never whether the rules would break. The question was how they would break, what would be found inside the breaking, whether anything worth saving survived the accommodations. And we have been answering that question throughout this script, finding in each broken rule something that speaks to the show's specific genius, its specific integrity, and its specific, stubborn insistence on continuing to matter even when the rules that should have governed its mattering were long since retired. The guest stars came and went. Many of them were brilliant in context. Some of them were purely decorative. All of them were part of the show's 36-year conversation with its own world and with the wider world that its world was always in dialogue with. And Springfield endured them all, absorbed them all, let them pass through, and then return to itself, to the family on the couch, to the town with no location, to the timeline without end, to the rules that broke and the show that kept going after. That is the rule that never broke. Not any specific rule about any specific character or event or location. The rule that the show goes on. The rule that Springfield is still there when you come back. The rule that the credits roll and the couch gag plays and the yellow family runs to sit together, and no matter what else has changed, this remains. Everything is negotiable except this. The Simpsons is still here. The rules broke. The show endured. We endured with it. That is, in the end, the story of every rule that The Simpsons broke. The story of what happens when the rules go, and the show that was built on them keeps building anyway. The story of Springfield as a place that should not exist, built on foundations that were never quite stable, maintained by a community that chooses, repeatedly and collectively, to maintain it anyway. By us, watching, loving, analyzing, cataloging the breaks, and pressing play again. Every time. A secondary character in a long-running show has a specific challenge that does not face characters in short-form fiction. The challenge is this. In a short story or a film or a limited series, a secondary character can be introduced, developed to the depth the story requires, used to do the specific work the story needs, and then concluded. The character serves a finite purpose and is measured against the finite demands of the story. They do not need to be more than what the story needs them to be. In a long-running show, secondary characters have no such luxury. They are introduced, developed, used, and then available for reuse in every subsequent episode for the duration of the show's run. They do not conclude, they persist. And the persistence creates a specific problem. A character who was introduced to serve one specific function will, over time, be called upon to serve many different functions. And as the character is bent to serve each new function, the integrity of the original character, the specific coherent identity that made them interesting when they were introduced, is gradually eroded. Springfield's secondary characters were, in their original forms, some of the most brilliantly specific comic creations in the history of television animation. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon, for instance, was, in his original incarnation, a genuinely complex figure. He was an immigrant who had made a specific kind of peace with a specific kind of American life, the life of the small business owner who works with the daily texture of his community and who has developed, through that daily texture, a genuine and specific relationship with the people he serves. He had a PhD in computer science that he was not using because the circumstances of his immigration had placed him in the Quickie Mart, and he had stayed because the staying was, in its way, a life. His relationship with Homer and the other regulars was specific. The jokes about his situation were grounded in actual understanding of that situation. Over time, Apu's characterization compressed into an accent and a set of recurring references. The complexity faded. The specific psychological grounding that had made him interesting in the early episodes was replaced by a more generic version of the character, built primarily around the most reproducible elements of the original portrayal. He became, in the show's later seasons, primarily a comedic accent and a set of convenience store references, divorced from the specific interiority that had made the early Apu worth spending time with. This is the Flanderization process operating on a secondary character. The name comes from Ned Flanders, as we noted earlier, and it applies with equal force to almost every secondary character who persisted through the show's entire run. Chief Wiggum began as a specific kind of incompetent lawman. His incompetence was not random. It had a specific character. He was a man who had internalized a certain idea of what a police chief was supposed to look like from the outside, and who produced that exterior appearance without the inner substance. He was not stupid exactly. He was willfully disengaged from the actual demands of his job in favor of performing the social aspects of his role. His corruption was a specific expression of this disengagement. He did not corrupt because he was a bad person in a simple sense. He corrupted because corruption required less of him than actual law enforcement, and less was always what he was looking for. This specific characterization, grounded in a real psychological type and observed with real accuracy, eroded over the seasons into a more generic version of comic police incompetence. The later Wiggum is a collection of stupid cop jokes without the coherent psychology that gave the early jokes their specific weight. The incompetence became the character rather than being an expression of the character. And the Wiggum who remained, while often funny, was less interesting than the Wiggum who had been a specific and accurate portrait of a specific and recognizable failure mode. The same compression happened to Sideshow Bob. This is perhaps the most interesting case among the secondary characters, because Sideshow Bob was the show's primary recurring antagonist, a figure of genuine intelligence and genuine menace, who appeared across multiple seasons in stories that were, in the early to middle seasons, among the show's most carefully crafted narrative achievements. The early Sideshow Bob stories worked because of the specific tension between Bob's genuine intellectual sophistication and his inability to overcome Bart Simpson, a 10-year-old of below-average academic achievement. This tension was both very funny and psychologically precise. Bob was the kind of person who had always been defined by his intelligence, who had always believed that intelligence should and would prevail over everything else, and whose repeated defeats at the hands of Bart were therefore both comic and genuinely humiliating in a way that maintained his menace rather than diffusing it. Bob was dangerous, not in spite of his ridiculous failures, but because of how seriously he took himself in the face of them. The later Sideshow Bob episodes, while still often featuring Bob's remarkable voice performance and musical moments, were increasingly governed by the expectations that the earlier Bob stories had created rather than by a genuine ongoing development of the character. Bob returned to try to kill Bart. Bob was foiled. Bob was incarcerated or exiled. Bob returned. The structure was so well established that it had become a genre within the show. The Sideshow Bob episode and the genre's conventions increasingly constrained the specific creative freedom that had made the early installments so effective. The rule that broke was the rule of developmental momentum. Early Sideshow Bob stories built on each other in specific ways. Each appearance added something to the character's history and psychology. Each defeat had specific consequences that shaped the next appearance. The character was moving through the show's world in a direction that felt purposeful, that felt like it might be building towards something. The later appearances felt less purposeful. They felt like visits, periodic deployments of a beloved character type for the specific pleasure of the character type, without the developmental momentum that had made the early appearances matter. Bob became a recurring pleasure rather than a developing story. And while recurring pleasures are valuable, they are a different thing from developing stories. And the difference is the difference between enjoying something and caring about something. The caring fades when the development stops. The enjoyment can persist indefinitely. But the caring, the specific investment in what happens to a character next and why, requires that the character be going somewhere rather than simply being somewhere. Springfield's secondary characters, by the later seasons, were mostly being somewhere. They were inhabiting their established positions in the show's world, available for deployment when needed, performing their established functions with skill and reliability, but rarely going anywhere. The rules about who they were had been fixed, not by creative decision but by the weight of accumulated usage, into shapes that served the show's immediate needs, but no longer served the deeper project of depicting a specific world full of specific people. This is one of the costs that a show pays for its own longevity. The secondary characters over time become institutions. And institutions, as we have noted, develop the self-protective conservatism of things that have worked and want to keep working. They stop developing because development introduces risk, and institutions are risk-averse. Springfield's secondary characters became institutional. Their original complexity became institutional complexity, available for reference but no longer operative in shaping new stories. Their rules became guidelines rather than governing principles, honored more in their invocation than in their actual function. And yet the characters persist. Springfield is full of them. 36 years of specifically imagined secondary characters who exist at various distances from their original complexity. The distance varies. Some are much closer to their original selves than others. Some have been maintained with real care throughout the show's run. But the general direction of travel is the same for all of them, from complexity toward comprehensibility, from specific toward general, From character toward type. That is the long arc of secondary characterization in The Simpsons. Not a fall, exactly. Not a catastrophic loss. More of a gentle slide from one mode of existence to another, leaving behind something in the transition that was worth keeping. Worth keeping and worth remembering. Tonight, while Springfield sleeps. Something held in The Simpsons through all the rule violations, through all the character compressions and timeline contradictions and geographic impossibilities and reset catastrophes. Something kept the show feeling like itself even when it was behaving like a different version of itself. Something in the experience of watching that was bigger than any individual broken rule, and that persisted through every accommodation the show made to the demands of its own longevity. That something was the voices. The voice cast of The Simpsons is one of the most remarkable creative achievements in the history of recorded sound. Dan Castellaneta's Homer, Julie Kavner's Marge, Nancy Cartwright's Bart, Yeardley Smith's Lisa, and the ensemble of secondary voice performers who, between them, gave Springfield its specific acoustic texture. These are performances that span more than 3 decades of recorded work, maintaining consistent vocal identities through every creative shift the show underwent, through every rule the writing broke, through every character compression and every timeline contradiction. The voices were the rules that held. This sounds like a small thing until you consider what it actually means to maintain a consistent vocal characterization across 36 years of performance. Voice acting of the kind The Simpsons demands is not simply the reproduction of a sound. It is the reproduction of an entire psychological state, the specific emotional coloring that makes a voice recognizably one person rather than another. Homer's voice is not just a sound. It is the sound of a specific kind of man processing a specific kind of life, with a specific combination of obliviousness and tenderness. When Castellaneta produces that voice, he produces all of those qualities simultaneously. The sound carries the character. What this means for the show's relationship with its broken rules is significant. The writing could break Homer's character. It could make him behave inconsistently. It could amplify his stupidity beyond any recognition of the early Homer's specific psychology. But as long as the voice remained consistent, as long as the performance carried the memory of what Homer had been, the character retained a thread of connection to his original self that the writing could not fully sever. The voice was a kind of storage. It held the character across the modifications the writing imposed. When you heard Homer's voice, even in a later episode where Homer was doing something the early Homer would never have done, the voice carried something of the early Homer along with it. Not enough to override the writing's modifications, but enough to create a sense of continuity that the writing alone could not have maintained. This is one of the underappreciated creative facts about the long-running animated show as a form. The voice performances accumulate meaning over time in a way that live-action performances cannot quite replicate because live-action performers age visibly while animated characters do not. The voice of a 50-year-old Dan Castellaneta performing Homer carries 35 years of the same voice performing Homer. The accumulation is audible. The history is in the sound. And this acoustic history, this recorded accumulation of the same performers playing the same characters through every season and every modification and every broken rule, is one of the primary mechanisms by which The Simpsons maintained its emotional coherence, even as its narrative coherence fractured. The audience recognized the voices and, in recognizing the voices, recognized the characters, even when the characters were behaving in ways that a strict application of the established rules would not have allowed. The rule about voice consistency held specifically because it was not a written rule. It was not a creative decision made explicit in a writer's room or a network meeting. It was simply what happened when the same performers kept showing up and doing the same work. The rule held because there was no mechanism by which it could be broken short of recasting the characters, which the show never did during the original cast's tenure. There is a specific dimension of this voice as continuity effect that is worth dwelling on. The voices of the secondary characters, particularly the voices produced by Harry Shearer and Hank Azaria, created a sonic world for Springfield that was so specific and so richly populated that the world felt real even when its written content was contradicting itself. Shearer's Skinner and Burns and Ned and Rainier Wolfcastle and Kent Brockman and a dozen other characters exist as a kind of acoustic community, each voice distinct and specific and carrying the full weight of the character's history in the quality of the sound itself. When Harry Shearer left the show for a period, the gap was immediately felt not as the loss of any specific character's written content, but as the loss of a specific acoustic quality that was part of Springfield's air. The world felt different without his specific contributions to its soundscape. This is testament to how thoroughly the voice performances had become the show's essential texture. This is also why the voice cast controversies that have occurred during the show's run, the various negotiations and departures and returns, have been experienced by the audience as existential threats to the show's identity rather than as simple personnel matters. The voices are not just performers filling roles. They are the primary medium through which the show's world is transmitted to its audience. Changing the voices would change the world more fundamentally than any written rule violation could, because the voices are the rules that cannot be broken without breaking the show at its most essential level. The writing broke many rules. The voices held the most important one. The rule that Springfield should feel like Springfield. The rule that Homer should sound like Homer. The rule that when you sit down and turn on this show, even 36 years after it began, the voices that reach you across the years should carry the accumulated weight of everything this world has been, all its contradictions and its beauties and its broken promises and its enduring warmth. The voices carry all of it. Every rule that broke, every rule that held, every catastrophe that was forgotten, and every moment of genuine feeling that persisted. The voices carry Springfield's entire history in the quality of their sound. That is the deepest rule of The Simpsons. The rule that held through everything. And hearing it is enough. Even tonight, even at the end of this long wander through the broken rules and the gorgeous wreckage of 36 years of television, hearing Homer's voice or Marge's voice or Bart's voice is enough to put you back in Springfield with a completeness that nothing else in this or any other show can quite replicate. The rules are broken. The voices remain. That is Springfield. That has always been Springfield. Not a place or a time or a set of consistent narrative principles. A sound. A family of sounds that reaches you across the years and puts you somewhere specific and impossible and entirely your own. Press play. You know where you're going. You've always known. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have walked through the broken timelines and the contradictory geographies and the rewritten characters and the forgotten catastrophes and the violated fourth walls and the compressed secondary figures and the voices that held through. All of it. We have been thorough. We have been patient. We have let each broken rule have its moment, have its examination, have the specific attention that all of these things deserve after 36 years of existing without being fully looked at. There is one rule left, the last rule, the one that holds everything else together, or fails to hold it, and determines, finally, whether any of the other rules matter. The rule of laughter itself. The Simpsons is a comedy. At its most fundamental level, it is a show that is trying to be funny. Every other thing it does, the satire, the characterization, the emotional honesty, the world building, the cultural commentary, everything else is in service of or in productive tension. With this central project, the show is trying to make you laugh. The rule of laughter is that the laughter should be genuine, not performed. Not the kind of laughter you produce because you recognize that something is intended to be funny and you cooperate with the intention. Genuine laughter. The kind that comes from actually finding something funny, from being surprised by a comedic connection you did not see coming, from recognizing something true expressed in a form that makes the truth both sharper and more bearable. The early Simpsons produced genuine laughter with extraordinary consistency. The writing was so sharp and so precise and so deeply in contact with specific human experience that the comedy landed with a force that the later seasons rarely matched. The laughter was real. You laughed because something was genuinely funny, not because the show had assembled the recognizable components of a joke in the recognizable order that produces a conditioned laugh response. As the rules broke, as Homer's character flattened and the timeline looped and the catastrophes were forgotten and the secondary characters became types, the quality of the laughter shifted. The laughter became more reliable in some respects, more consistent, available on demand in the way that a well-oiled machine is available on demand. But it became less surprising, less likely to catch you off guard, less likely to produce the specific quality of genuine delight that the best comedy provides. The rule of laughter itself did not break entirely. The show in its later seasons still produced genuine comedy. The writing still occasionally achieved the specific surprise that genuine laughter requires. The voice performances still carried the comedic weight of the characters' accumulated histories. The animation still found visual gags of genuine invention. The show remained, in its best moments, very funny. But the frequency of the best moments declined. The density of genuine laughter relative to performed or conditioned laughter shifted. And the shift was the show's most significant loss, because the laughter was the point. Everything else, the rules and the characters and the world, was in service of the laughter. When the laughter becomes less genuine, everything in service of it is implicated. This is the final rule violation, the most fundamental one, the one that encompasses all the others, because the others were all ultimately in service of this one. The rules broke because the show was chasing laughter. The characters flattened because flat characters are easier to write jokes for. The timeline looped because reset buttons allow more premises, and more premises allow more jokes. The catastrophes were forgotten because consequences constrain comedy, and comedy needs space. The fourth wall's bent because meta-humor is a reliable source of laughs in the specific context of a long-running show that its audience knows well. All of the broken rules were in service of the rule of laughter. They broke in order to keep the laughter coming. And the laughter did keep coming. Less genuinely surprising, more reliably produced, but present. The show that broke all its rules to keep producing laughter managed, in its way, to keep the laughter alive for 36 years. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary achievement. The history of television is filled with shows that broke their rules and lost the laughter. The rules broke and the show went dark and nobody watched. The Simpsons broke its rules and the laughter persisted. Changed, modulated, less frequently transcendent, but persistent. And in the persistence there is something worth honoring. Something worth sitting with on a quiet night, in the soft darkness of the hours when the world has gotten quiet and the choices available to you have narrowed to something simple and restorative. You can put on The Simpsons. You can let the voices come through the speakers and fill the room with the sound of Springfield. You can let the couch gag play and let the theme music do its particular thing to your nervous system and let the story, whatever story this week's episode tells, unfold in the comfortable light of the television. And you will laugh. Not with the exact quality of laugh that the early seasons produced in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when everything was fresh and the rules were new and the world of Springfield was just being discovered. But you will laugh. Because the show is still funny. Because the voices still carry their accumulated weight. Because the world, however broken its rules, is still Springfield, still specific, still recognizably the place you have been returning to for however long you have been watching. The laughter that persists after all the rule-breaking is the show's true achievement. Not the satire, which other shows have matched. Not the characterization, which other shows have exceeded in specific ways. The laughter that survived the breaking of every rule that the show established. That persisted through the decades of accommodation and compromise and creative shift. That laughter is what brought you here tonight. What keeps you watching? What keeps Springfield alive in the culture? What fills the forums and the social media threads and the conversations between people who grew up watching the same show and find themselves, decades later, still able to share a reference, still able to invoke a character or a moment or a line and have it land between them with the specific pleasure of shared experience. The Simpsons broke its rules. The Simpsons made you laugh. 36 years. 800 episodes. Still going. Still making you laugh. In whatever mode, with whatever quality, with whatever combination of genuine surprise and comfortable familiarity the current episode manages. Still Springfield. The rules broke. The laughter held. That is the end of the story. And also not the end. Because Springfield does not have endings. It has episodes and credits. And then the next episode, in the permanent present of a town that has been rolling forward without progress for longer than most of its audience has been alive. There will be another episode. There is always another episode. And when it comes, when the couch gag plays, and the voices start, and the yellow family assembles in the house on Evergreen Terrace in the town that should not exist, but has existed and continues to exist and will keep existing, Springfield will be there. Broken rules and all of them. Every geography and every timeline and every character and every death and every catastrophe and every relationship and every fourth wall and every guest star and every saxophone note and every voice and every laugh. All of it. Still there. Still Springfield. And so, we have come to the end of our long walk through Springfield's broken rules. We started, you and I, in a familiar place, the town on the edge of memory, the town that everyone knows without ever being able to say exactly where it is on a map, the town that has been there every Sunday night for 36 years, that has outlasted governments and cultural moments in the childhood of everyone who watched it growing up, that is still there now, still rolling forward in its impossible permanent present, still yellow and still loud and still exactly itself, while being slightly different from what it was the last time you looked closely. We have walked through 10 major categories of the show's self-contradiction, through the broken character rules, and the broken timeline rules, and the broken geography, and the broken deaths, and the broken economics, and the broken catastrophe memory, and the broken relationships, and the broken fourth wall, and the broken secondary characterizations, and the broken rule of laughter itself. We have found in each of those breaks something that illuminates the show's specific nature, its specific genius, its specific compromises, the specific bargains it made with itself over 36 years in order to keep going, to keep the family together, to keep the couch warm, to keep the credits rolling on Sunday nights when the rest of the television world was doing something else entirely, and The Simpsons was doing what The Simpsons has always done, which is showing up. Showing up is an underappreciated virtue in creative work. The shows that broke their rules and stopped showing up are forgotten. The show that broke its rules and kept showing up anyway is the longest-running animated series in American history. The showing up is itself a kind of rule-keeping, the keeping of the most important rule, the rule that the audience's loyalty should be honored with continued presence. The Simpsons showed up for you, every week, every season, for 36 years. Whatever else it did wrong, whatever rules it violated, whatever compromises it made with its own early ambitions, it showed up. And that, in the end, is why we are here tonight. Not because the rules held, not because the show was always as good as it was in the early years, because it was not always that good. Not because every episode was as carefully observed and as emotionally honest as the best episodes of the first 6 seasons, because they were not. We are here because the show showed up, because the voices were always there, because the family was always on the couch, because Springfield was always somewhere, impossible and specific and entirely its own, waiting for you when you pressed play. The rules broke. The show went on. You are still here. That is The Simpsons. That is what it is. That is what it always was and what it continues to be. A show that has survived its own rule-breaking by the simple, extraordinary, underestimated virtue of continuing to exist. Homer is on the couch. Marge is patient. Bart is trouble. Lisa is reaching for something just out of reach. Maggie is watching everything with those enormous eyes and thinking something that she has decided not to share yet. The town is impossible and specific and yours. The timeline loops. The geography shifts. The rules are broken. And Springfield endures. The show will be there when you wake up. It always is. That is, and has always been, the whole point. There is a specific pleasure in cataloging the smaller rule violations. Not the seismic character shifts or the geographic impossibilities, but the smaller, more intimate contradictions that reveal themselves on close viewing, on rewatch, on the kind of long, devoted attention that a show earns from its most committed audience. These smaller contradictions have their own specific character. They are not the product of creative philosophy or deliberate artistic choice. They are the product of 800 episodes produced over 3.5 decades by writers who were doing their best under significant time pressure, with a shared understanding of the world they were depicting that was necessarily imperfect and necessarily evolving. They are the contradictions of honest craft, the places where the seams show, where the weave of the fiction has a moment of inconsistency that is visible if you lean in close enough. But they are also, taken together, a kind of portrait, the portrait of a living world, one that breathes and shifts and contains the evidence of its own making within its texture. The smaller contradictions are the fingerprints of the show's construction, the evidence that human beings made this, that it was built with love and care, and also with haste and necessity and the ordinary imperfection of all human-made things. Homer's dietary preferences shift with notable inconsistency across the show's run. His love of donuts is canonical and essentially absolute, but his relationship with other foods varies in ways that serve particular episodes without always being consistent with each other. He has been established as loving specific foods and hating specific foods, and both the loves and the hates have been violated in subsequent episodes when the violation made a better joke. The rule about Homer's specific dietary history was always in competition with the rule about Homer being funny, and the rule about being funny won every time there was a conflict. Bart's social circle at school contracts and expands with an inconsistency that is visible over the full run. His best friend is Milhouse Van Houten. This is unambiguous and consistent. But the secondary social world around Milhouse and Bart, the question of who else Bart is friendly with and on what terms and how those friendships function in the texture of his daily life, is handled with the flexibility of a show that deploys secondary characters as needed rather than maintaining a fixed social ecology for its central child. Nelson Muntz appears as Bart's enemy, as Bart's companion, as Lisa's sometime romantic interest, as a background character in classroom scenes, as a character whose home situation provides genuine pathos in specific episodes and who is then returned to his established comic function in others. His character has a dual nature that serves two different tonal registers, the comic bully and the sad child behind the bully, and the show moves between them without always maintaining the clarity that both registers require to function at their best. Ralph Wiggum is a character whose entire comic existence is based on a single trait, the non sequitur utterance, the declaration that operates on a logic inaccessible to everyone around him. Ralph says things that do not connect. He says things that almost connect but veer away at the last moment into somewhere else entirely. He says things that are purely, perfectly, inexplicably funny in the way that only the most precisely wrong thing can be funny. The rule about Ralph is that his non sequiturs should feel genuine, should feel like the product of a specific but opaque mental world that has its own logic even if that logic is not accessible to us. The early Ralph utterances had this quality. They felt like windows into something real, however strange. The later Ralph utterances were sometimes less precisely wrong and more generically random, the distinction between genuine non sequitur and random absurdity collapsing in ways that reduce the comedy's precision without reducing the show's commitment to deploying Ralph as frequently as possible. These smaller violations accumulate. They do not each individually matter very much, but in aggregate they create a texture of gentle inconsistency that is part of what it means to know a long-running show deeply, to have watched it enough that you notice the places where the seams show, where the construction is visible, where the fiction admits the evidence of its own making. This texture is not a failure. It is, in its specific way, one of the things that makes Springfield feel like a real place, rather than a perfectly controlled fictional construction. Real places have inconsistencies. Real communities contradict themselves. Real histories contain the evidence of human imperfection in their details. A show without any internal contradictions, without any places where the seams show, would feel more like a simulation than a world. The imperfections are the evidence of reality. The contradictions are the proof that something genuinely human made this, that the love and the haste and the care and the exhaustion and the inspiration and the ordinariness of 36 years of creative production are all visible in the texture of the work. The smaller broken rules of The Simpsons are its humanity. They are the show being a made thing rather than a perfect thing. And made things, the things we actually make rather than the things we imagine we might make if we had unlimited time and resources and creative freedom, have a specific beauty that perfect things cannot approach. The beauty of effort, the beauty of persistence, the beauty of something continuing to exist and to be loved despite, or perhaps because of, its visible imperfection. Springfield is a made thing. Homer is a made thing. The broken rules are the evidence of the making, and the making was beautiful. 36 years of beautiful, imperfect, rule-breaking, laughter-producing, heart-touching making. That is what we have been walking through tonight. Not a catalog of failures, a catalog of evidence. Evidence that The Simpsons was here, that it was made, that people cared enough about it to make it badly sometimes and brilliantly often, and that the making was worth doing and worth watching, and worth spending a long night examining in the quiet, comfortable way that only things we genuinely love can be examined. The rules broke because the making was real, and the making was beautiful. There is a question that has been hovering at the edge of this entire script, a question that every piece of analysis about a long-running show eventually has to face. It is not a question about the show itself. It is a question about the audience, about you, about why you are here, tonight, listening to someone talk about a cartoon that has been on television since before many of its current viewers were born. The question is simple. Why do we keep watching something that has broken its own rules so thoroughly and so completely? The answer is not simple. It is layered in the way that all the answers to genuine questions are layered, each layer revealing the next. None of them the final truth, but all of them part of it. The first layer is habit. We watch because we have always watched. The Simpsons is part of the rhythm of life for everyone who grew up watching it, and the rhythm is not easily disrupted even when the quality of what fills it changes. You tune in because you have always tuned in, because the Sunday night at 8:30 position is a fixed coordinate in the week's emotional geography, a place you return to because you have always returned to it. The second layer is nostalgia. We watch because the show carries our own history in it. The episodes we remember from childhood are still there, still accessible, still capable of producing the specific quality of recall that we associate with our most vivid early memories. The Simpsons is a vessel for a specific kind of remembered life. The life of watching television on the family couch, of understanding the world through the show's satirical lens, of sharing references with siblings and friends and parents in a way that created a specific kind of communal experience that streaming has made harder to replicate. We watch because the show is where we keep a piece of ourselves. The third layer is affection. We watch because we love these characters, not the later versions of them, not the flattened or amplified or rule-violated versions, but the characters themselves, the essential qualities that persist through all the modifications, the things about Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie that are still recognizably themselves even when everything around those essential qualities has shifted. We love them the way you love people you have known for a very long time, which is to say with full knowledge of their flaws and their contradictions and their moments of behaving worse than they should, but with an affection that survives the knowledge. The fourth layer is genuine appreciation for what the show still does well. Because it does still do things well. The animation has grown more sophisticated. The voice performances have accumulated depth. The cultural satire, when the show brings its full attention to bear on something worth satirizing, is still sharp and still accurate, and still arrives with the specific authority of an institution that has been watching America carefully for longer than any other animated show in history. The best of what the show does is still genuinely best of. The broken rules did not break everything. And the fifth layer, the deepest one, is the one we started with and the one we end with. We watch because Springfield is a form of home. A home that exists outside of geography and outside of time, that is always available, that keeps the family together in the amber of its impossible permanent present, that never ages and never ends and never makes you say goodbye. That is what a broken rule cannot reach. The specific quality of a fictional home that is yours. The feeling of returning to something that was always waiting for you, that has your history in it, that is patient enough to be there whenever you come back. Springfield is patient. Homer is patient in his way, and Marge in hers, and Bart and Lisa and Maggie in theirs. The town endures. The family persists. The couch is warm. The television is on. And we are here. All of us who love this impossible, rule-breaking, 36-year-old cartoon with its broken timeline and its impossible geography and its flattened characters and its forgotten catastrophes and its voices that carry the weight of decades and its laughter that persists. Through everything, we are here because we love it. Because it earned the love. In its early years, with honesty and precision and genuine creative courage. And because having earned the love, it maintained it, imperfectly and with accommodations, through everything that followed. That is a remarkable thing, a rare thing, a thing worth spending a long night exploring in the company of someone who finds the exploration as interesting as you do. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield with me. The rules broke, the love held, and that, finally and completely, is the whole story. The town is quiet now. Evergreen Terrace is still. Homer is asleep on the couch, as he has been sleeping on the couch for 36 years, in the dream, or the radiation field, or the collective fiction, or simply the television show, whichever of these it turns out to be. Marge has gone to bed. Bart is planning something for tomorrow. Lisa is reading. Maggie is watching. The nuclear plant is on the horizon, its cooling towers trailing their perpetual steam into the Springfield night. The same steam that has been rising from those cracked towers since 1989. The steam that may or may not be the explanation for everything The steam that rises and disperses and rises again without resolution or conclusion. The town is here. The family is here. You are here. Springfield will be exactly where you left it when you come back. It always is. That is the whole point. The Simpsons has been on television since December 17th, 1989. It is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running sitcom, the longest-running scripted primetime show in the history of television. The rules broke. The show is still on. Nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, neither have we. Not quite. Not in the part of us that still feels the theme music and knows, before the couch gag even plays, that we are home. That part stays young. That part is Springfield. That part endures. Good night.